Welcome back to the Mojave, and always true to Caesar, as it would appear in this episode. Today we're going to be talking about the machete, the premier weapon of Caesar's Legion, and I guess all of the machete family, which there's actually 4 versions of the machete in this game, and this will probably be one of the first melee weapons that you get introduced to. You can actually find them pretty early on throughout the wasteland if you know where to look, and you're going to see them pretty obviously with Caesar's Legion, so you can pick them off of dead Legion members. Whether you kill them or somebody else kills them, you can get a machete pretty easily. So the base machete is kind of weird and interesting just in and of itself, since it's a lawnmower blade that's been kind of sharpened into a machete and then just taped to a stick, which is a little bit odd, but okay. This one requires 25 melee weapons in order to wield and 3 strength. Fairly low requirements for a melee weapon, nothing really crazy there. And if you're going with a melee build, you're likely going to have a lot of strength since you get more damage with melee if you have more strength, so you might as well have a lot of it there. This one has 11 damage per hit, 33 damage per second, which are both kind of low. This one does attack fairly fast, but doesn't hit really that hard. This one does do 11 crit damage, which is not super high, but it's okay. This one has a 1.5 times crit modifier, which is above average, so you're more likely to hit crits with the machete, which is kind of cool. This one does cost 20 action points to use during VATS, which is pretty low. You can actually spam this out pretty quick. It's not going to be as good as something like Brass Knuckles, which we just recently talked about, but it's okay. The machete weighs 2 weight, and this has 50 item health, which is pretty low. Machetes do break pretty fast, but that's not such a huge deal because you can fix them really easy. The machete and some of its unique versions also have a unique ability which makes it so they do increased damage towards limbs. So this would be arms, legs, anything like that. You can break limbs easier with the machetes. This one is 2 times with the base machete, so that's pretty nice. The machete, just like all melee weapons, also has a unique VATS attack in it, so once you hit 50 melee, then you can use this unique VATS attack. For the machete, this is called backslash. This allows you to do a little bit less damage than you normally would with the regular slash from machete, but it does make it so it costs a little bit less action points overall. So you can maybe squeeze a couple more backslashes in, maybe 1 or 2 more, but it's not one of the stronger unique attacks that melee weapons have in VATS. It's just kind of okay overall, and you might get a few more hits out of this. So for a standard machete, its pros are that it's very common. You can find these all over the place, and the extra limb damage is really nice. You can break limbs even quicker than you normally would, which can help on certain enemy types, especially particularly slow enemy types where you can break their limbs and then just keep kiting them as you can keep hitting them. Whenever they go to swing, just back up and then come back in and swing. That could be a decent option. Major cons to this though are that it does do low damage. It has fairly low damage per second, and it also has very low item health. You're going to be breaking the machete pretty quick. There's also just a whole lot better melee weapons even early on than something like the machete, so it does fall off pretty hard. I mean, you can just go to the Good Springs water source and grab a shovel, and the shovel's probably going to outdo the machete in basically everything besides, I guess, it being a one-handed weapon. But even then, this isn't a sneak-in weapon, so you can't even sneak machetes in. You couldn't sneak the shovel in either, but yeah, machete is not really one of the strongest melee weapons. It's not a terrible weapon and it's not unusable, which is why I'd put it into our D tier on our tier list. It's okay, but you're probably going to get rid of it pretty fast, and there are better options. Let's talk about some of the unique versions of the machete next. First up, we have the broad machete. The broad machete, I think, looks a lot better than the regular machete because this one does kind of look like a bolo machete, which is pretty cool looking. This one you actually get at the very start of the game if you have the tribal pack. So you have the tribal pack, you start out with this, you start out with some throwing spears, and you start out with some venom, which you could put on your machete, so if you hit somebody with it, then they take damage over time, which can be pretty good. This one does have different stat requirements than the standard machete, with having 0 melee weapons required and 3 strength. This one is really good at the start because it's kind of like a go-to weapon. Melee, you don't have to worry about breaking all that quickly most of the time, and it works pretty well since a lot of the time you're not going to have a lot of bullets early on. This one does 15 damage per hit, which is a bit better than the regular machete. It does 49 damage per second, which is also quite a bit better than the regular machete. Has a 2 times crit modifier, which is really good. Has 15 crit damage, which is okay. 17 action point cost, which is fairly low. That's actually lower than something like the Brass Knuckles. So this one does actually have a kind of a niche with an action point build, at least early on. This one only weighs 1, so 1 less than the regular machete, which is awesome. And this one has slightly better item health at 75. It's still going to break fairly quick. This one doesn't break that much slower than the regular machete. It also doesn't have increased limb damage like a regular machete. That doesn't matter so much, as I would say that this one is a better option than the regular machete, and it's a pretty decent option into the early game for a melee weapons build or an unarmed build. and you may not have something real strong right away, you can use this in the early game to get a little bit of an advantage, not use up your ammo if you're not even going to be using a melee or unarmed build, at least primarily. So it does have some bonuses there, and I would put this one a tier higher than the standard machete up into C tier, at least into the early game. It does fall off pretty hard, just like the regular machete though, so late game, there's not a whole lot of difference between this and a regular machete. For another unique machete, we have the Liberator. You can get this one by completing a quest or by killing a Caesar's Legion member who has this and then taking it off of him. This one requires 25 melee weapons, 3 strength, same as a standard machete. Does 18 damage per hit, which is quite a bit more than a regular machete. Has 62 damage per second, which is pretty good. We're actually getting into pretty good damage with the Liberator here. 3 times crit modifier, which is really nice, although its crit damage is only 18, but hey, hitting crits more often is going to get you more damage overall and more DPS, so that's pretty nice. This one costs 18 action points, which is better than the regular machete, 1 less than the broad machete, but still pretty good. This one has even more limb damage than a standard machete at 2.5 times. This one weighs 2, just like a standard machete, and this one does have slightly better health than a regular machete. It has 75, same as the broad machete, so it'll also break quick. But again, machetes aren't hard to find to fix these up, and if you're running jury rigging, it's really easy to fix melee just in general. So if you want to use it for that, it can be okay then. And this is actually a pretty decent early game option, since the quest is not particularly difficult to do for the Legion, or you can go over there and kill the Legion, which is also not particularly hard to do either for the NCR, and take the Liberator off of them. And then you'll actually have a pretty decent early game weapon that's a bit better than the broad machete. I would still probably put this one into C tier, the same as the broad machete, but it is kind of nice. I should also mention that all of these machetes have the same VATS attack as well. The unique ones do as well. They all have backslash on them. And then we have one more class of machete with our 4th class of machete, and this one is called the Machete Gladius. The Machete Gladius is actually not a unique version of the machete, however there are a limited amount of these, so it's sort of unique. Usually higher leveled members of Caesar's Legion will have something like the Machete Gladius on them, assuming they don't have something stronger like the Chainsaw or the Ballistic Fist or whatever it might be. These weapons are more for like the ranking officers, I guess, in Caesar's Legion. So this one also requires 25 melee and 4 strength to wield, 1 more strength than all the other machetes. This one does 28 damage per hit, which is pretty decent. This one has 84 damage per second, also quite good. The damage per second with this one is really nice. It has 28 crit damage, which is fine. It has a 1.5 times crit modifier, which is also good. Has the same crit modifier as the regular machete. Costs 20 action points to use, same as the regular machete. Weighs 2, has 75 item health, so it's a little bit better than a regular machete again in terms of item health, although these do break quick, but again, you can fix them with other machetes, so it's not a huge deal. And this one does do double limb damage, just like a regular machete. This is just the machete plus, basically, where I would say it looks cooler, and it's also just straight up stronger than a regular machete is at basically everything. This one I'd actually put a tier higher than the other machetes too. I'd put it up in a B tier, as it is actually a pretty decent weapon. It's still not one of the strongest melee weapons in the game. It's not one of the strongest one-handed melee weapons, but it's decent, and if you do want to rush to, let's say, Caesar Legion and kill them and take some of these, you absolutely can, and it can be a pretty decent early and mid-game weapon. Gonna fall off towards the later game, and you could just argue that you could go for Chance's Knife, which would be even earlier than this, and it would be a whole lot better. But if you really like the aesthetics of the Machete Gladius, then it can also be pretty decent. All the machetes are kind of okay to pretty good, at least with the Machete Gladius thrown in. None of them are really standouts. There are a couple of perks we should probably talk about, though, for melee weapons just in general that help them out a lot. Slayer is really good. It gives you more attack speed, which is just fantastic. Other things like Piercing Strike can be really good, where you can just ignore armor with melee and unarmed, which is really, really strong in general. And Super Slam, which is really strong as well, since you knock down enemies. And with weapons that attack really fast, knocking down enemies is very easy and very consistent too. You just knock them on the ground and just keep smacking them. And they usually can't fight back, assuming they don't have friends around that can also fight you. And even then, with a really fast attacking weapon, you can probably knock multiple enemies down and still keep hitting on them while they're on the ground. So melee can just be pretty crazy by itself, but that's more the perks making it crazy than necessarily like the weapons being crazy. So in conclusion, should you use the machete or part of the machete family? I would say yeah in the early game, and maybe in the late game if you're going with the melee build, but only maybe. There's better options than the machete. There's a lot better weapons. In kind of terms of everything, in terms of damage per second, being a holdout weapon, better weight, better item health overall. Again, something like Chance's Knife is kind of just better than all of these at everything. So that one would just be a go-to for me over this. But if you really like the aesthetics, then by all means use the machetes. They are kind of cool weapons just in and of themselves. Today we're going to be taking a look at a cooking implement, I guess. Today we're going to be looking at the cleaver and the unique version of it, the chopper. So the cleaver is an early game melee weapon that you'll probably find basically right at the very start. A lot of regular people can carry around the cleaver, and a lot of powder gangers, for whatever reason, carry around the cleaver as well. The cleaver is, I guess, supposed to be a cooking tool, but it's been repurposed into a weapon, which, yeah, you could absolutely do that. I don't see a problem with that. For the base stats of the cleaver, this one requires 0 melee weapons and 2 strength to wield, so any character can use this. Basically everybody's going to be taking more than 2 strength regardless, unless you're doing a challenge run or something, but even then you can actually get more strength than that. You could even just drink a beer and you'd have that +1 strength to wield the cleaver effectively. Plus, if you're going to the melee build, you're probably going to be building a lot of strength since your damage can scale off of that. For damage, this one does a whopping 7 damage per hit, which isn't very high. This one does 18 damage per second though, because it does attack at least fairly fast, which is nice. This one has 7 crit damage, which again isn't very high because it's whatever its base damage is most of the time. This one has a 1x crit modifier, so average crits. This one costs 22 action points, which isn't super high. That's actually kind of low for an early game melee or unarmed build, which is kind of nice unless you get like brass knuckles or something. This one weighs 2 weight overall, and this one has a surprisingly high 250 item health. It takes a long time for the cleavers to actually break. That's really good. That's as high as like brass knuckles are, and brass knuckles are one of the best early game weapons too for a melee or an unarmed build. This one also does have a unique effect on it, similar to the machete that we talked about not too long ago. This one does 1.5 times extra limbs damage, so you can break limbs a little bit quicker with the cleaver, which is actually pretty good early on, especially for a melee build. If you can break their legs, or if you can break their torso fast, then you can just keep smacking them and staggering the enemy. If you can break their legs, they can't move around as quick. If you can just break their arms, you can do more damage too, so all of that is pretty nice. And it makes it so the cleaver is actually an okay early game weapon. For the general pros of the cleaver, this one has really high item health, which is great. This one does decent damage per second. It's not really that high, but the unique ones is, so I figured it should be mentioned here. And this one does have the limb damage, so breaking limbs early on can actually save you quite a bit of hassle in the early game. For the general cons of this weapon though, the cleaver does kind of fall off. It's not really that great compared to some other somewhat early game weapons like the shovel. I would say that one is better than this, and things like brass knuckles or spike knuckles, which you can also find fairly early on too. But at least this one can kind of compete with them since it has its own unique niche with the limb damage. It also doesn't have really high damage. That's sort of another con to this weapon. And if you wanted to like rush Chance's knife, then this one really doesn't have much of a purpose. But then realistically, like 90% of the other melee weapons don't really have that much of a niche either when you're just taking that into account. So assuming you're not doing that and you're just playing the game normally, the cleaver is okay enough. For a general ranking on my tier list, I would put the cleaver into C tier. It's not going to be anything crazy, it's not going to be anything spectacular, but in the early game, it can at least do some damage. And melee does kind of have the advantage of having really strong perks associated with it too. You can still stack things like Slayer, Super Slam, Piercing Strike, Purifier on top of this, if you want to have more damage towards basically anything, and that kind of carries melee weapons and unarmed weapons as a whole, and why there's so few really terrible melee or unarmed weapons in general. Let's talk about the unique version of the cleaver now, that being called the chopper. The chopper you can find at Wolfhorn Ranch. This is actually Ulysses' camp, or Ulysses' home, in at least the canon. He's not actually there, but you can go into his house and take this. This is just found right on top of his stove, and this one does look a little bit different. It has a more rusted look or a more patinaed look to it than the standard cleavers do, kind of surprising. It also has more of a arch, at least on the back part of the cleaver. I actually really like the look of the chopper, even though it's very simple. This one also requires 0 melee weapons and only 2 strength to wield, which is fantastic. This one does more damage, with it being 14 damage a hit, so it's still not super high. However, its damage per second is pretty high at 55 damage per second. This one actually attacks much faster than a regular cleaver, so the damage per second is nothing to scoff at there. This one does 14 crit damage, so not super high there, but it has a 2x crit modifier, so you're more likely to hit crits. This one costs 22 action points, same as a regular cleaver, which is still pretty good for a VATS build. This one also weighs 2 weight, still has the 250 item health, so it doesn't break very fast, and this one still has the 1.5 times extra limb damage, so you can break limbs even quicker with this one. This I would say is absolutely worth taking, and you can grab it pretty early on, especially if you just want to rush there. since you don't actually have to fight anything to get this. You just have to walk into the shack and grab it, and it's going to be on your way to do most of the quests in the normal game anyway, so you might find it completely by mistake. This one is totally worth getting in the early game because it is so dang strong, especially compared to regular cleavers, and since regular cleavers are so common in the early game, it's not going to be hard to repair this if you need to, because its item health is pretty good. We should also talk about the unique VATS attack too. I always forget to talk about that. But the unique VATS attack for the cleaver, for both cleavers, is the backslash attack. It's the same thing as the machete, and this makes so you do 70% less damage with that VATS attack, but it costs 5 less action points. So instead of costing 22, it would cost 17. That's okay. It's really not a amazing unique attack to have in VATS. The cleaver and the chopper also count as improved holdout weapons. I should mention that too. So if you have 50 sneak, you can sneak either of these into casinos or other areas. And the chopper can actually be pretty decent in those areas. It may not be as strong as certain other weapons we've already talked about on here, like the spike knuckles or love and hate. For an overall rating for the chopper, I'd actually put this one higher. I'd put this one into B tier. This one's actually a pretty decent melee weapon. It's not as good as certain melee weapons that you could get up to this point. Again, Chance's knife exists, but if we're counting that, then again, like 90% of the melee options just aren't as good as that, and that's not really fair. Compared to everything, it's actually a pretty good weapon. It's a pretty good melee weapon, and again, melee kind of carries itself thanks to all the perks that it has. So should you use the cleaver and the chopper? The cleaver, maybe. It's okay enough at the start, but if you're not doing a melee weapons build, then maybe you don't want to take it. And if you have like the broad machete at the start, you may just want to skip it anyway, because you'll probably use that up until it breaks. And then the chopper, I would recommend. It's pretty decent. Again, it's not going to be a top tier melee weapon, but it's going to be pretty decent. And if you want to keep it as a holdout weapon, it's also pretty good. Tell me your thoughts on the cleaver and the chopper down in the comments below. Today we're going to be taking a look at the humble knife and multiple variants of the knife, because I figured this would be better if we just kind of include all of the knives, or at least quote-unquote all of the knives. There's still quite a few other ones that we need to talk about, since we haven't talked about the straight razor yet, which I guess you could argue is not a knife. The combat knives and the Bowie knives will not be included in this because they're distinct enough so that they should get their own list, in my opinion. But we have plenty of knives to talk about. Let's go over each of these. Our very first one is the simple knife. This is the kitchen knife that you can find all around the wasteland. And this one is actually not a terrible early game weapon if you find these, because almost every enemy can have these early on. Like powder gangers can have them, raiders can have them. You can just find them laying all over the place. It's really common for vendors to sell knives too, and they're super cheap. Knives require 0 melee weapons and only 1 strength to wield, so any character can effectively wield a kitchen knife. I would kind of hope so if it's this early of a weapon. The knife does 8 damage per hit, which is not very high, but it's okay. 24 damage per second. You can actually swing the knife fairly fast, which is kind of good. This one has 8 crit damage, which is the same as its normal damage, so fairly low. 1 times crit modifier, which is fine. That's the base crit chance. Costs 20 action points, which is also okay. It's somewhat low, but with the low damage, it's not incredible. This one weighs 1 weight. And this one has 150 item health. That's actually a pretty decent amount of health for an early game weapon, especially unarmed in melee, where health is more important than necessarily damage for them, because you don't want to really be repairing them right away. And they can just last you quite a while, to where they'll save you on overall ammo too if you're not going with a dedicated melee or unarmed build, so that way you can save up for some of the guns you might want to use. The knife and all of the variants, except for one of these, actually has the same exact VATS attack, where if you have 50 melee, you can use this VATS attack, and this is backslash. Backslash costs less action points to use, but it does less damage. It's an okay VATS attack. It's nothing special, doesn't have anything bonus to it, so that's perfectly fine. For the pros of the knife, and a lot of these knives, they're all very lightweight, which is cool. Pack Rat actually helps with them, so they all get cut in half. So their weight is usually like half a weight. Some of them have extra limb damage, which is pretty good. The regular knife doesn't, but some of the other ones do. And some of them have pretty good action points. The regular knife is okay on these two. So if you want to use it in VATS early on, that is pretty good. The major cons to the knives, though, are that they do low damage, and they have low damage per second, and just kind of low stats all the way around, besides the item health being usually pretty decent on these. So they may not be the best choice for everything for a melee or unarmed build in the early game, but they're not a terrible choice, especially if you don't want to break your better melee and unarmed weapons you might get early on, like a baseball bat, a shovel, brass knuckles, spike knuckles, something like that. There are several perks that help out with these. Pack Rat is one of them, where it can cut their weight in half. That's kind of useful. Super Slam to knock down enemies, Slayer to swing faster, Piercing Strike to punch through armor, and Purifier to kill some of the other abomination enemies you're probably not going to be taking on, like a Deathclaw with a knife, although there is an achievement for doing that with the Switchblade, which we're going to talk about here in a second. And that can be kind of useful, especially if you have Super Slam. You can knock them down and just keep stabbing them, and you will win that fight, at least if it's a one-on-one fight. For an overall rating for the regular knife, I think I'd put this one into D tier. It's fine. It's an okay early game weapon. It's not crazy. There's no unique variants of the knife either, which is a little bit strange. But at the same time, you're probably going to ditch this fairly quick into the game. Our second knife is going to be the Switchblade. You can also find this one very early on into the game. Various raiders can have this. You can find it in boxes. Store owners tend to sell it. The Switchblade requires 25 melee, weirdly enough, and 1 strength, so most characters will be able to use this fairly early on, especially a melee or an unarmed character. This one does 7 damage per hit, so it's less than the knife. 14 damage per second, which is also less than the knife, but it does at least attack fairly fast. Has a 2x crit modifier with 11 crit damage, which is okay. That's a bit better than the regular knife. This one only costs 18 action points to use, so that's actually fairly good for the VATS cost. This one weighs 1 weight, and this one has 100 item HP, which are all fine for the Switchblade. Also, all of these weapons are holdout weapons, as you would kind of expect, so that you can sneak these in. The Switch, I think you can also sneak all these in without 50 sneak. I'm pretty sure none of them count as improved holdout weapons. Pretty sure they're all just regular holdout weapons, so that does make them kind of useful. The Switchblade is all around just kind of lower statted than the regular knife, but it doesn't really feel that much worse, because it does still attack fairly fast, and does a similar amount of damage. This one can break a little bit quicker, so I'm going to put this one into lower D tier than the regular knife, but I'm not going to put it quite into F tier because it is still kind of useful in the early game, but it's bordering on there. It's definitely not one of the better weapons. After that, we're going to move over to the Dead Money knives, which are the Cosmic Knife, the Cosmic Knife Clean, and the Cosmic Knife Superheated. So first up, we have the regular Cosmic Knife. This one also requires 0 melee weapons and 1 strength to wield, just like a regular knife. This one does 12 damage, so it's better than a regular knife. 36 damage per second, which is also better. This one has 12 crit damage, so that's kind of okay. 1x crit modifier, costs 20 action points, weighs 1, has 150 item health. All around, the Cosmic Knife is just an upgrade from the standard knife, which, I mean, that's how they're advertised in the game anyway. These were supposed to be like the cutting edge knives that you see in infomercials, so they're slightly better than regular kitchen knives. This one also has a unique bonus on it where it does 1.5 times extra limb damage, which that is good because in Dead Money, if you have extra limb damage, you can kill the ghost people a little bit easier because you're more likely to rip their limbs off. That's pretty good. The Cosmic Knife is okay. It's a bit better than a regular knife, so I'd put it higher in D tier than the regular knife, but it can't really go much higher than that. If you're going to rush Dead Money, which is an interesting strategy and not one that I would really recommend, then the Cosmic Knife could be useful on a melee or an unarmed build because you don't really have too many options there. But then you have the Bear Trap Fist, which is going to be your best unarmed or melee option there, so you're probably not going to bother with the Cosmic Knife. Next is the Cosmic Knife Cleaned. This can be made on workbenches. You do need to have the requirements so that you can actually clean this, and that's not too difficult to find all the ingredients to do that. This one also requires 0 melee weapons and only 1 strength to wield. This one does 15 damage per hit, so it is better than the regular Cosmic Knife. 45 damage per second, it attacks at the same speed, so makes sense that it has higher DPS. It has 15 crit damage, so that's a little bit higher. A 1.2 times crit modifier, so you're more likely to hit crits with it a little bit. That's kind of useful. Costs 20 action points to use in VATS. Weighs 1, has 200 item health, so this one is actually quite a bit better, so it's not going to break very fast. As well as this one has 3 times limb damage, which is much better. That's actually really good. That's one of the highest amount of limb damages in the entire game, so you can rip off the ghost people's limbs a little bit easier with this one, so there's no real reason for you to not be using the clean knife over the regular knife. This one also is the only weapon that doesn't have the same VATS attack, where this one is not backslash, but this one has one that's called Surgical Strike. This one costs a little bit more action points, but it does quite a bit more damage. This one costs 5 more action points to use, but gives you 150% more damage with the knife. That's actually a pretty good improvement, and that makes it so that this weapon is quite a bit stronger. Again, it's still not going to beat out something like the Bear Trap Fist for just overall usefulness, but this is the best of these knives, or one of the best of these knives, and I would move this one up to high C tier. It still has kind of low damage per second, so I'm not going to take it over other melee and unarmed weapons like the Bear Trap Fist in Dead Money, and outside of this, you could just go with something like the Katana, or let's say like the Combat Knife or the Bowie Knife, which are all going to be stronger than this, but at least this one does kind of have a niche in the DLC itself, so that's kind of cool. And then our very last knife is the Cosmic Knife Superheated. This one you need to actually get into the Sierra Madre and get the recipe in there, and then you can make these. These ones require 0 melee weapons and 1 strength to wield effectively. This one does 14 damage per hit, 42 damage per second. Its DPS is actually fairly good. This one does 14 crit damage, same as its regular damage. Has a massive 5 times crit modifier though, so you're basically guaranteed to hit crits assuming that you have decent luck. Costs 20 action points to use in VATS, weighs 1, and has 150 item health. So this one is pretty good. This one also is weird where it has a 1.7 times extra limb damage. Why that is, I don't know. This one can also do fire damage on top of its hits. The weird thing about this though is that it's not affected by the Pyromaniac perk for some reason. You would think that the superheated knife would be, like the superheated fists are, but it's not. This one just doesn't get a bonus from Pyromaniac. Kind of a missed opportunity there. I feel like other weapons should have also been affected by Pyromaniac, and this should have been one of them, but it's just not. Making it so this weapon is just a straight upgrade to the regular Cosmic Knife, so I would put this one also into C tier, probably below the clean one, since the clean one has more damage per second, and it also has the better VATS attack, even though this one can hit crits more often. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Combat Knife in Fallout New Vegas. This is one of my favorite weapons, favorite melee weapons in New Vegas, and it seems like a lot of people's favorites. It's also a weapon that I've been mentioning a lot, basically whenever we bring up unarmed and melee weapons. So let's finally talk about it. The Combat Knife is a early to mid game weapon, and it can also be a late game weapon. You can find these actually all over the place. The combat knives aren't very uncommon. A lot of the times you can find them around soldiers. Sometimes the great cons can be, well, just carrying them as well as have them near where they're at. NCR tends to have them near where they're at. Even the Legion tends to have them where they're at. So combat knives are quite common throughout the wasteland. It's not particularly difficult to find them. The standard combat knife requires 50 melee weapons and 3 strength in order to wield, so it's fairly low requirements for a melee build, and kind of what you'd expect for a mid-game weapon overall. This does 15 damage per hit, which is fairly low, but it has high damage per second at 49 damage per second, so that's quite good. This one also does 15 crit damage on hit, which is also pretty decent. This has a 2 times crit modifier, meaning that combat knives are more likely to hit crits than other weapons. That's really good. Low action point cost at 17. So you can spam this in VATS pretty often, and that also makes it pretty strong in the early game. This only weighs 1 weight, so it is extremely lightweight. It's really easy to carry around combat knives, and they are a lightweight weapon that is worth carrying around because they at least sell for a decent amount. And this has 90 item health, so the item health isn't really the highest with this, but it's okay. For the pros of the combat knife, high damage per second is really nice for this weapon, even though the damage per hit is somewhat low. It has good crits, it hits crits pretty often, so that's really good. Has really good action points, so if you want to use it in VATS, that can be pretty strong. And it is a very early game weapon, or at least the unique version can be an extremely early game weapon where you can get it in the first couple minutes of the game, so that is a real good advantage of this weapon and why it's kind of hard to compare it to other melee weapons, or why it might be unfair to compare it to other melee weapons. These also both have the same VATS attack. Any melee weapon does have a unique VATS attack once you hit 50 melee, and you can unlock this in VATS. For the combat knives, this is backslash. We've talked about this before, where it's just less damage but less action points. So that can be an okay trade-off if you want to use it. You might be able to get another hit out of it than standard attacks. It's nothing way crazy. It's not a unique specific attack to the combat knife, so it's just kind of whatever. It's the same with most of the other knives that we've talked about, with few exception. The only real con to this weapon is that it kind of has low item HP. It might break sort of fast. Once you have jury rigging, that's not an issue because you can repair it with any other one-handed melee weapon, so that's really strong. And you're never going to have to worry about it breaking then, because you're going to be able to find a one-handed melee weapon by the time that it's about to break, I'm pretty sure. Whether that be a knife or a pipe or whatever it might be. This one is actually affected by multiple perks. This one might have the most perks per weapon to it. So this one is affected by the cowboy perk because it counts as a hunting knife. So you get more damage thanks to cowboy. This also counts as a combat knife since it is a combat knife for grunt, which makes it so you get even more damage on top of that. Those stack together, which makes it so the DPS from this thing goes even higher, which is pretty crazy. You can have pack rat affect this because it weighs only 1 weight, so it can be cut down to half a weight. Not a huge deal, but it is something that does affect it. VATS perks are incredibly strong with this. Action Boy, Action Girl, Math Wrath. They just give you better action point cost overall. Super Slam is really good for this, like any melee weapon, because you can knock down enemies. Piercing Strike is really good too, because you can just punch through armor. Purifier is good if you want to fight Death Claws and fight super mutants with it. And then Slayer is also really good because you get even faster attack speed, where this weapon already has really fast attack speed. We could go even further with other perks that affect this, like Ninja would also affect it, and things like Bloody Mess would also affect it, so it has a lot of perks going for it, and you could make a build feasibly just to build all around the combat knife, and it would be a very strong build. I basically did that when I did my Grave Robber only run, because the unique version is found inside of a grave, so that does help it. For an overall rating for the combat knife, I would say this thing's very high A tier because it's just really good overall. These also count as improved holdout weapons too, so you can sneak them into casinos and other areas once you have 50 sneak, and that makes them very strong too because they're already quite strong against armored enemies. They're very strong against light and non-armored enemies because they attack so quickly. They're just one of the best weapons for doing that with, which is awesome. Now let's talk about the unique version, which is called Chance's Knife. This one does look slightly different than a regular combat knife because it's always permanently stained in blood. Chance is one of the guys who was kind of involved in trying to get you killed, or was about to be trying to get you killed. So he was a great con, he died, and he was buried just above Goodsprings. If you run up to his grave with a shovel above Goodsprings, you can dig up his grave, you can find some great con armor in there, and you will also find Chance's Knife. You can get this right at the very start of the game because there is a shovel that you can find in Goodsprings right away. And then if you want to run right there, you can ignore the Cazadors or just sneak around them, open up the grave, and you'll have one of the strongest melee weapons in the entire game. It is crazy how quickly you can get this, and it makes it kind of unfair to a lot of other melee weapons that just fall off super hard then. Basically all the early game melee weapons don't hold a candle to this thing. Most of the mid game weapons don't either, and even into the late game, this one still holds its own quite well. There are some better options than this overall as melee weapons, but not by that much, and if you're not going with a dedicated melee build, like let's say you want to go with a cowboy build or something, this one is still really good for like an improved holdout weapon if you want to sneak this into places where you might need a knife, or if you want to just kill smaller enemies with it, even though you're not going with melee perks. This one is still really good at getting up close and personal with. So Chance's Knife requires 50 melee as well, 3 strength. Not very high requirements, you can actually get those right at the very start too, so if you're going with a melee build, you can already have this thing set up. This does 22 damage on hit, which is fairly high, 91 damage per second, so its DPS is really high, and these are also increased even further if you have like Cowboy and Grunt, so you can get even more damage out of them and even more damage per second. This does 22 crit damage, same as its normal damage, has a 2x crit modifier, so it's more likely to hit crits. This one still only costs 17 action points, so it's very good in VATS. This one still only weighs 1 weight, and this one still has the 90 item health. So it might break a little bit fast, but even so, it's not that big of a deal because you do have extra damage on this. And as soon as you get jury rigging, it's not a huge deal. You can keep fixing this one up forever. This one is going to go right up to S tier in my tier list because I think it's one of the best early game weapons in the game, and I think it's just one of the best holdout weapons, best melee weapons in the entire game. It is really, really strong. It also makes it so melee and unarmed builds have a massive advantage over other builds if you want to grab this right away at the very start, because this one you can go and do whatever the heck you want with, and you're probably going to be able to do it fairly well. Even more so once you start getting perks like Super Slammed with this, since it attacks so dang fast. So would I recommend the Combat Knife and Chance's Knife? Yeah, absolutely. They're very good. Chance's Knife in particular is really, really strong. It's fantastic. You can get it early. Really cool. Welcome back to New Vegas, everybody. Welcome back to the Wasteland, where today we're going to be taking a look at the Bowie Knife and its unique variant, Blood Nap. Just a real quick side note, and I guess a history lesson for anybody wondering. I have gotten quite a few comments whenever I've talked about the Bowie Knife compared to other weapons in this game, and people wondering why I call it a Bowie Knife and not a Bowie Knife. And usually people cite the reference of David Bowie, which kind of makes sense because it is spelled the same way, but this knife is named after Jim Bowie, who fought at the Alamo. That would be the correct way to say it. However, if you want to say Bowie Knife, then that's perfectly fine too. It's just that there is a reason why I was calling it that. That being said though, David Bowie is also pretty awesome, and it would be pretty cool to see him playing a character fighting at the Alamo. Maybe you could call him Jim Bowie just to make it even more confusing. Anyway, let's get to the actual weapon we're going to be talking about this time. So this is the Bowie Knife. The Bowie Knife can be found in the Divide. This is often carried by the Marked Men. The Marked Men actually have a very high chance of carrying around Bowie Knives on them. So much so that you can actually just find them on dead bodies, and you can find these right at the very start of the Divide. So if you really want to, you can actually run right to the Lonesome Road, just go into the bunker and find the first Marked Men corpses laying around, loot a Bowie Knife off of them, and then run right back to the Wasteland, and you'll have a pretty strong starting weapon. So the Bowie Knife requires 75 melee and 3 strength to use. A lot of melee, quite a lot. If you're going to grab this right away, you might not have enough, even if you're pumping melee right at the start. 3 strength is pretty achievable though, so that is pretty nice. This one does 23 damage on hit, which is fairly high, especially for the start. It's actually quite good for a melee weapon. This one does 80 damage per second, which is also quite high. This does attack very fast. This one does 35 crit damage. It actually has more crit damage than it has regular damage, which is really good. The Bowie Knife also has an increased crit chance at 1.5 times, so you're more likely to hit crits with it than you otherwise would be with other weapons. This one only costs 20 action points to be using in VATS, which is quite strong. And this one does have its own unique VATS attack, Once you have 50 melee, this one is called Dirt Nap, which this one does a little bit less damage, but it costs less action points, so it can be pretty useful to be using in VATS. This one weighs 1 weight, which does make it so Pack Rat actually affects this, so it could be cut down to half a weight, which is really good. And this one has 100 item health, which is alright. It's about the same as like Combat Knives, it's slightly more. The Bowie Knife and the unique version Blood Nap are also considered improved holdout weapons, so once you have 50 sneak, you can sneak these into any holdout area, which is very strong. If you thought the Combat Knife and Chance's Knife were really strong, the Bowie Knife and Blood Nap are arguably even stronger than those weapons, so they are very good. For the pros of the Bowie Knife, these ones have pretty high damage per second, which is pretty good. They are very lightweight, you can carry around these no problem, and they do sell for a decent amount, so if you want to pick them up off of Marked Men, that's basically just money if you're not going to be using them as a weapon. And they also have a fairly low action point cost, so that's pretty good. The unique version even more so that's really nice. The cons to the Bowie Knife are really not that much. One is the health. The health is not the best, but it's not the worst either. It's just you can break these fairly fast if you intend on using them a lot. That might not be an issue, especially if you have jury rigging. You can fix this with any other one-handed melee weapon, so that's really good. The other con is, I guess you have to go to the Divide. Blood Nap, that's more of an issue because you do have to go through about 3/4 of the Divide in order to get it. The regular Bowie Knife, you barely have to walk into the Divide and you can find a Bowie Knife. So it might be a con more for the unique version than for the regular version. There are also quite a few perks that help out with these weapons. Cowboy does help out with these because these are considered combat knives, at least for Cowboy. So you do get more damage with them that way. However, they're not considered combat knives for Grunt. So you will still get the 25% damage boost from Cowboy, just not the extra 25% from Grunt like the regular combat knives, making them also arguably better than this. Although I would say it's a toss-up between Blood Nap and Chance's Knife as to which one's better. They're both really good. So Chance's Knife is much easier to get than Blood Nap though, so it does kind of have that in its favor. Aside from that, regular melee and unarmed perks really help out with these too. Slayer for attacking faster, these things already attack really fast, but you can attack even quicker. Super Slam for knocking stuff down, that's really strong for a melee build or an unarmed build. Piercing Strike to punch through armor. Purifier to kill certain things like Death Claws and Super Mutants. These ones rip through just about everything, so they can definitely kill them pretty fast too. On top of that, I did mention Pack Rat, so you can cut the weight down on these, and if you wanted to incorporate VATS perks as well, you could also do that. They would be really good in this sort of build. For an overall rating for the Bowie Knife, I would say that this one is a solid A tier. It is a very good knife overall. It's a very good melee weapon. So let's move over to the unique version, which is called Blood Nap. Now, Blood Nap can only be found in the Courier's Mile, which is the most dangerous place in pretty much all of New Vegas, because in the Courier's Mile, that is where you have the irradiated marksmen and you have the irradiated death claws. And if you're playing on like the very hard difficulty, Death Claws can one-shot you unless you pump chems into yourself or you have damage reduction. Even if you have the biggest, tankiest armor on and the most amount of health and the most amount of damage threshold, on the very hard, the Death Claws can one-shot you. Good news is, Blood Nap is actually found right at the very start of the Courier's Mile. So once you go there, once you have this place unlocked, so that is get through about 3/4 of the Divide, launch the missile, and then you go back to the start of the Divide. Once you're in the town, then that area will be opened up and you can go into the Courier's Mile. Blood Nap is stuck inside of a telephone pole or a light pole, so you can just pull that out and you'll have Blood Nap. Blood Nap actually has different requirements than the regular Bowie Knife, which is kind of weird. This one requires only 50 melee and 4 strength, so 1 more strength but 25 less melee, which is very strange. I don't know why that is. This one does 30 damage on hit, which is very good. 111 damage per second, and that damage per second can go up quite a bit thanks to perks. This one also has higher crit damage than it has regular damage at 45. Really good. The 1.5 times crit modifier that the regular Bowie Knife has on it, which is also awesome. This one only requires 17 action points to be used in VATS, making it a very good VATS weapon. This one also only weighs 1 weight, and this one has 100 item health. There is also another unique effect that Blood Nap actually has on it, where if you have Blood Nap equipped, you also get plus 10 sneak. So that's pretty cool. And since you can sneak this into places, if you only had, say, 40 sneak, or around 40 sneak, and then you equip Blood Nap, you could potentially just sneak this right into casinos, so that's pretty cool. Blood Nap also has its own unique VATS attack as well, where it has Blood Nap as its VATS attack, which is similar to Dirt Nap, but even more damage. Actually quite a bit more, so that's pretty nice and still kind of a low action point cost. Blood Nap is probably one of the best VATS melee weapons in the game, and probably just one of the best melee weapons overall in the game. I would put Blood Nap all the way up into S tier. It is really good, especially since you can stack so much damage on it. You can sneak it into places, it's fantastic. I consider this a potential upgrade to Chance's Knife, which is quite the compliment, because Chance's Knife is definitely one of the best melee weapons in the game too, so having Blood Nap rival it, or potentially even be better than it, that is pretty awesome. Tell me your thoughts on the Bowie Knife and Blood Nap down in the comments below. I'd love to hear them. How do you guys enjoy using them? I think they're both really cool. I like them both. Thank you guys so very much for watching this. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will talk to you guys next time. Bye-bye, everyone. Today we're going to be taking a look at two melee weapons. We're going to be taking a look at the Straight Razor and its unique variant, Figaro. So, the Straight Razor is one of the earliest game weapons that you can find, and I'm kind of surprised I didn't include it when I was going over the knives, but the Straight Razor is kind of its own thing. So the Straight Razor can be found extremely early on. You can find this right away in Good Springs if you want. It's pretty common that Chet sells these. You can sometimes find them in boxes laying around. Sometimes you can find them on powder gangers that might have them, and some other raiders that could have Straight Razors on them, or inside of their camp, which is kind of nice. The Straight Razor requires 0 melee in order to wield and only 1 strength, so literally any character can wield the Straight Razor, which I would kind of hope so. I would hope most people would be able to wield a Straight Razor. This one does 5 damage per hit, which is extremely low damage. This one does 19 damage per second. The Straight Razor, even though it doesn't do very much damage, it does at least attack fairly fast. It does have short reach though, because it is a knife. This one does 10 crit damage, actually does double the crit damage that it has regular damage, which is kind of nice. This one does have a 2x crit modifier, making it fairly likely to hit crits, which is nice. This one only costs 18 action points, making it pretty good in a VATS build. Weighs 1 weight, so it is affected by the Pack Rat perk, which is kind of nice. It can go down to half a weight, which does make sense. And this one has 75 item health, making it so it breaks fairly fast. This one also has the unique VATS attack of Backslash. Both this and the unique version have that, which is basically a little bit less action points for a little bit less damage. You do need to have 50 melee in order to use these special VATS attacks too. And that's okay overall. For the general pros of the Straight Razor, this one does have okay damage per second. It's not amazing. It's okay at the start compared to other melee weapons, but it is going to fall off pretty hard later on. And it is a sneak-in weapon regardless, so you can have 0 sneak and still be able to sneak Straight Razors into casinos, which is kind of cool, even though this isn't really that great of a sneak-in weapon compared to other ones that we've talked about before, especially if you have the improved sneak weapons where you can have something like combat knives, or Power Fist, or Spike Knuckles. There are some better melee and unarmed weapons to just kind of take into the casinos or the holdout areas over the Straight Razor. For the major cons of these, they do have low item HP. Both this and the unique one have low item HP and they can break pretty quick. That might not be such a big deal because they are fairly common, so you can fix them up pretty regularly. And if you're going to fix this up at like a vendor, they're not going to charge you very much, so that's okay. And this one does fall off hard. Even if you're comparing it to other one-handed melee weapons, there's still a whole lot better ones. We've talked about Chance's Knife, we talked about Blood Nap. Those ones are incredibly strong weapons. We're going to be talking about the War Club here pretty soon, so there is some other weapons that are just all around better than the Straight Razor at basically everything. But just like all melee weapons, you can have quite a few perks that can carry these, or at least make them a little bit better. Slayer helps with increased attack speed, so that one's always nice. Super Slam to knock down enemies. Even though this is a one-handed weapon, it can still knock down enemies, and that's pretty good. Purifier makes so you can kill certain enemy types like ghouls and super mutants a little bit easier, as well as death claws. I don't know if you want to be fighting death claws with the Straight Razor, but you could do it if you'd like. And then you also have Piercing Strike to punch through armor, so that's also pretty good. And like we talked about, Pack Rat also helps with this since it can cut its weight down in half, even though you don't really need to be carrying around a whole bunch of Straight Razors. Although I guess if you want to keep repairing them, it's not going to weigh you down very much, so that's pretty nice. For an overall rating for the Straight Razor, I'm probably going to put this thing into like D tier on my tier list. It's not the worst melee weapon, but it's pretty bad. It's pretty low down there. It's not completely unusable, but it does fall off really hard, so you're probably only going to be using it for like the start of the game. Let's talk about the unique version of it, which is called Figaro. This one you can find at the King's Place, actually on the Strip, which is nice, or I guess just before the Strip in Freeside. So Figaro does look a little bit different, where it has like a pearl handle on it, and it has some sort of design on the actual blade, which is kind of cool. You get something out of that. This one also requires 0 melee and only 1 strength to wield, meaning any character can use it. This one does do 8 damage per hit, 33 damage per second, has 16 crit damage, again keeping with the theme of having more crit damage than regular damage. This one has a 4 times multiplier though, so this one has a very, very high chance of hitting crits, which is really good. This is one of the highest, if not the highest, out of any melee weapon. I can't think of any weapon that actually has more than this. There's a couple that have 3 and there's a couple that have 2, but most of the time it's a 1 times modifier. This one actually has a 4 times modifier. This one costs 17 action points to use in VATS, weighs 1 weight, and has 90 HP. This one is a bit better than the regular straight razor, and if you want to rush to Freeside in order to grab this, it's not actually a bad weapon if you want to be sneaking it into casinos. I would still say that there's better sneak-in weapons, like we talked about with Chance's Knife, or Love and Hate, potentially some of the power fists like Grease Lightning. There are better melee weapons than this and unarmed weapons than this, but this one's not terrible by any means. The extra crit chance certainly helps it, and it makes it so that it can do at least a decent job towards most enemies that you would be fighting that are either unarmored or are inside of casinos, so either unarmored or very lightly armored. For an overall rating for Figaro, I would probably put this one a tier higher and put it up into C tier. It's decent enough, and I wouldn't blame anybody who just wants to use it because it looks kind of cool, and it actually does hit crits, so it's not a terrible weapon, but it's by no means an incredible weapon either when you go over like one-handed melee weapons in Vegas. It's just kind of alright. And that'll do it for the straight razor and its unique variant. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Katana. This is a Gunrunner's Arsenal exclusive weapon that was added in that DLC. And it's a weapon that has appeared in quite a few different Fallouts. Well, maybe not always the Katana, but you get versions of this, a Wakazarshi, various swords and stuff. It was in Fallout 3, so that's pretty awesome. The Katana just kind of fits in a wasteland setting anyway, so that's sort of nice. This weapon, since it is a Gunrunner's Arsenal exclusive weapon, means you can only buy it from Gunrunners, and, well, not necessarily from Gunrunners, but only from vendors. It does make it so the upgrades for it are a lot more common than it otherwise would be, though. So you can find the Katana's parts pretty easily. Traveling merchants might have it, Gunrunners could have it, various other vendors like Crimson Caravan or 188 or whatever. They might also carry parts for this, so that's pretty nice. Be sure to check around and talk to different people here. It's also not super expensive to buy a Katana or buy the parts to it, so it can be a pretty decent, like, mid to late game melee weapon. Even into the early game, if you want to rush it, you can probably find it pretty early on too. So the Katana requires 75 melee weapons and 4 strength. Pretty high melee weapons requirements. Strength is pretty low, which is fine. You're probably going to go with a decent amount of strength for melee weapons and unarmed build anyway, just because they benefit greatly from strength, so having more strength is awesome. This deals 22 damage per hit, which is fine. It's not one of the highest, but it's still decent enough. This deals 71 damage per second, which is pretty good. That's a pretty decent attack rate, and the Katana does attack fairly fast, and it does have decent reach to it as well for being a one-handed melee weapon, since the Katana is just a one-handed melee weapon, which is a little bit strange. I kind of wish you could two-hand it, or it was a two-handed weapon, because that would help out a little bit more with like Super Slam. Maybe that's why they did it as a one-handed weapon, because that might be a little bit too strong. I don't know. Just kind of spitballing here. This does 22 crit damage, same as its normal damage. That's not too weird. Has a 2x crit modifier, so it has a higher chance of hitting crits, which is really good. This only costs 21 action points to use in VATS, making it a pretty decent weapon to be using in VATS, and it does have a unique VATS attack, and is one of the strongest, if not the strongest VATS attack in the game, which is called Unlabored Flawlessness. This one only costs 19 action points, so it actually costs less than a regular VATS attack would be, but it deals 250% melee damage on hit, which is pretty crazy. It makes it so it deals a massive amount of damage, and I'm pretty sure that the VATS attack in this is also the power attack, because the power attack seemed to be doing pretty high damage when I was using it too. This is also supposed to be a reference to Ninja Gaiden, which I've never played any of the Ninja Gaiden games, but that's pretty cool that it's in the game. This one weighs 3 weight, so it's not super heavy, and this one has 200 item health, which makes it so it doesn't break very fast. The Katana has a lot going for it as an overall just general purpose melee weapon, which is really good. It also has another unique effect on top of that though, where it deals double limb damage, similar to like the Machetes, so you're more likely to cripple limbs with the Katana, which can be really good. Makes it so more enemies are likely to stumble with this, and if you want to combine it with a perk like Super Slam, stumbling enemies, knocking them on the ground, and just beating them down pretty fast is all really good, and it makes it so the Katana is a very consistent weapon throughout most of the game. For the pros of the Katana, this does really high damage per second, which is good. This has really good item health. It doesn't break very fast, which is also nice. The VATS attack and the action point cost that it uses is really good too. It's one of the best VATS attacks in the game. And it just uses low action points in general, so that's pretty good. You can spam out these attacks pretty often. The only real con to the Katana, besides like other melee cons like it doesn't have range, is that you kind of just have to buy it, and that's about the only con to it. And it's not even going to be that expensive to buy. You can usually buy katanas for fairly cheap from various vendors. They're not going to cost you thousands and thousands of caps, but they might cost you a couple hundred caps, and that's not such a bad investment. Maybe it'll cost you a couple thousand caps for a fully decked out katana, but that's okay, most weapons do. There is also plenty of perks that help with the katana too. Let's go over some of them. So you can go with Slayer. Slayer is really strong, faster attack speed with a weapon that already attacks really fast, makes it so your DPS goes up even higher. That's really nice. Piercing Strike makes it so your katana has armor breaking on it, really good as well. Purifier makes it so you deal extra damage towards various abominations like the Death Claws and stuff, making it so the katana is pretty good into the late game for strong enemies. You can go with basically any sort of VATS perk too, Action Boy, Action Girl, Math Wrath, whatever it might be, in order for you to get more action points so that you can use this more in VATS. That can also be really good. And of course, Super Slam is a staple for any sort of melee and unarmed build, because if you knock something on the ground and there's only one of it, you've pretty much already won that fight. It's not going to be able to get up by the time you can just keep wailing on it, and it's going to keep falling over. For an overall rating for the katana, I would probably put the katana in very high B tier or low A tier. It's a very solid weapon, and this is just the base katana. The base katana is pretty decent. It works really well as a general purpose melee weapon. It actually competes with a lot of other early game melee weapons, which is good too. It can kind of compete with something like Chance's Knife and Blood Nap until you start getting perks, and then those kind of outcompete it as well. But it is still a very good weapon in the early game and the mid game, and if you're just going for a dedicated melee weapons build and you're just playing normally, then it's going to be a very solid weapon for you. Let's talk about the modified version of the katana next, because the mods do help it out quite a bit. Since this is a Gunrunner's Arsenal weapon, you are going to have to buy those mods from different traders, and the katana can get 3 of these mods, which can help it out quite a bit. The Authentic Blade gives you 5 more points of damage, which is pretty good. That makes it so your base damage goes from 22 to 27. That's a good buff for damage overall. Then you can also get a Protective Sheath. This gives you 50% more item health, so you go up to 300 item health with the katana, making it so that it breaks very slow. It's one of the more durable melee weapons. I think that's the same as like the baseball bat, so it'll take you a long time to actually break this weapon down entirely. And then you can also get a Balanced Grip as the third option, which gives you 20% increased attack speed, so even more DPS for a weapon that already has pretty high DPS. And then, of course, that can be increased with various chems. Something like Psycho could give you more damage. Slasher could help as well. Rushing Water could also give you a higher attack rate. And it makes it so the katana is very strong overall. For the modded version of the katana, I would probably put this one up into A tier, because the katana modded out is really nice. It's probably one of the better weapons. I don't necessarily think it's one of the top tier melee weapons. You could disagree with that though, and I could totally understand that though, because the katana is really strong. You can totally use this all throughout the game and have no problem with it. I just don't think it's as busted as some of the other melee weapons you can get, like Chance's Knife, Blood Nap, maybe Oh Baby as well, something like the Chainsaw. But it's still like just the tier below that. It's very much competing with them, maybe even exceeding them if you're going with a dedicated melee VATS build, where the unlabored effortlessness is really going to help out, because that 250% damage increase is pretty substantial. And against certain enemy types that you can break limbs on really easy, then the extra limb damage is also really nice from this. So katana, fantastic weapon. Would I recommend it? Yeah, absolutely. If you're going to the melee weapons build, try it out. It is a really cool weapon. If you're not going to the dedicated melee build, it can still be okay. I probably wouldn't recommend it over something like, again, Chance's Knife or Blood Nap, just because those weapons are more lightweight, they benefit more from perks, and you can also sneak them in. You can't really sneak the katana in anywhere, sadly. I wish you could. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Shishkebab and its unique variant. So the Shishkebab is not necessarily a new weapon to New Vegas. It first popped up in Fallout 3, and it's also in Fallout 4. I believe it's in 76 as well. So the Shishkebab is a homemade weapon that is a lawnmower blade that is lit on fire, where your person is also holding like an oven mitt in order to hold the handle. It's definitely a interesting weapon that I think belongs in the Wasteland. The Shishkebab is generally considered a later game melee weapon. There's not a whole lot of enemies that actually have this. There are a couple that can have it. The White Legs are the ones that come to mind if you go there at high levels. Otherwise, you're probably going to have to buy a Shishkebab from somewhere, because most other enemies don't have it. Raiders don't really have it. Legion doesn't really carry it around, although you think it would be a perfect Legion weapon. The Shishkebab requires 75 melee and 6 strength to wield, so fairly high melee. Strength is about normal, but you're probably going to have high strength running a melee character anyway. This one does 40 damage on hit, although since this is a fire weapon and it does count as a fire weapon, this also deals fire damage on top of that. This deals 2 fire damage on hit for 5 seconds after the fact. This has 92 damage per second, plus that extra fire that deals more damage over time, so its DPS can be up a little bit higher depending on how many enemies you're hitting and how long they're burning. This one has 20 crit damage, half of what its regular damage is, which is kind of interesting. Some melee weapons are like this. This one one has a 2x crit modifier though, so you're more likely to hit crits with it, which is pretty nice. That makes it so you can get even more damage per second, which is always good. This only costs 28 action points to use, which is pretty good. Both this and the unique version of it have the same VATS attack once you hit 50 melee. For this, it's backslash. Backslash costs less action points to use, but does less damage. It's an okay VATS attack. It's nothing way crazy. It's just alright. This one only weighs 3 weight, so it's not that heavy. And the Shishkebab has a massive 500 item health. It's one of the most durable melee weapons in the entire game. There's very few other melee weapons that are actually nearly as high item HP as this one for some odd reason. There are some that are technically higher than this, like the chainsaw and the Thermic lance, but those ones hit multiple times really fast and break really fast as well. The Shishkebab doesn't. It attacks at a normal speed and breaks at a really, really low speed. So this is probably one of the best melee weapons if you just hate repairing your stuff, which generally isn't too big of an issue, especially if you're going with jury rigging, because then any one-handed melee weapon can fix this up. If you are, then you won't even need to really worry about shish kebabs. You'll likely be able to fix this up on your own with weapon repair kits or have somebody else fix it for you. So the item HP is really, really cool. For the general pros of the shish kebab, this one does actually have pretty good damage per second. It has pretty good damage per hit as well, and it has very high item HP. It takes a really long time for the shish kebab to break, which is really cool. The only real con to the shish kebab is that it's kind of rare. And I have heard, at least from some other people, that the flames are a little bit, not necessarily distracting, but somewhat block your screen. Because the shish kebab does take up a somewhat decent amount of your screen. It's not the most for melee weapons, but it can be a little bit confusing when you're sitting there like slashing people and they're lit on fire, and you can have quite a few things on fire around you, and it just kind of blocks your vision as to which one's attacking you compared to other melee weapons that don't have that particle effect. There are a lot of perks that can help out with these weapons too, so we have all the regular melee and unarmed that we go over in all these videos. So Slayer for extra attack speed, Super Slam for knocking down enemies, Piercing Strike for punching through armor, Purifier to kill certain types of enemies, and then most importantly for this one is Pyromaniac also affects it. This is one of the few weapons that Pyromaniac affects. It's probably going to be one of the main options that you consider when taking Pyromaniac. This one or the Saturnite Fist Superheated, which we just recently talked about, are two of the best melee and unarmed weapons, and they get even better because of Pyromaniac, because that gives you 50% more damage on top of this. For an overall rating for the shish kebab, I'd probably put the shish kebab either up into high A tier or low S tier. I think it's really good. I think I'm going to put it into high A tier for the moment, but it's a very solid all-around option. If you have Pyromaniac, it lets you have really high damage and damage per second. This thing attacks pretty quick, so you can rack up that damage really fast. It's also very hard to break, so a lot of good selling points to the shish kebab. Let's move over to the unique version, which is called Gehenna. Gehenna is a Gunner's Arsenal specific weapon, so you do need to have that DLC. You're also going to have to buy this from the Gunrunners. Weirdly enough, the Gunrunners actually sell this. I really feel like this should have been given to like the Great Khan vendor or like a Legion vendor or something, because it is a bladed weapon, but you just go up to the Gunrunners and buy this. This is going to be fairly expensive, but it's not one of the most expensive DLC weapons, so that's pretty nice. This one also requires 75 melee and 6 strength to wield, same as the regular shish kebab. This one does slightly more damage at 42 damage on hit, as well as it does more fire damage, dealing 5 fire damage for 5 seconds. So you get more damage over time thanks to this. This one also looks a little bit different, where you can see like the valve and the motorcycle handbrake, I believe, that comes off of it is a blue color rather than just kind of the rusted red color that is on the regular shish kebab, as well as the fire is slightly different. It's more of a yellowish flame than it is a red flame compared to the regular shish kebab. This does 116 damage per second, plus that extra fire damage, so more damage per second over time. This has 21 crit damage, slightly better than the other one. Has a 2x crit modifier, same as the regular one, which is pretty good. Only costs 25 action points, which makes it pretty decent in a VATS build. This one weighs 3, just like regular shish kebab, although this one has less item HP than the regular shish kebab, only having 400 instead of 500. That's still plenty of HP for a melee weapon. You're probably not going to be breaking this one super fast. This one I would say is all around just better than a regular shish kebab. So if the regular shish kebab is on like low S tier, high A tier, I'm going to put this one up into S tier. I think it's one of the better melee weapons that you can take. It does do pretty good damage. It definitely has a style all of its own. I'm kind of sad that you can't build one of these like you could in Fallout 3, but either way, it's really cool that there is the shish kebab returning in New Vegas, and I find it to be a pretty cool weapon overall. Would I recommend the shish kebab and Gehenna? Sure, if you're going with a melee build, they're actually quite good. If you're going to go with Pyromaniac, it's probably one of your best options besides the Saturnite Fist Superheated, which you could argue is better than this or worse than this. They're both really good options. You could take both on that same build too. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Bumper Sword and its 2 unique variants, where they are 2 of the strongest melee weapons in the entire game, And the regular bumper sword is not really lacking either. So let's talk about each of these. These weapons are probably going to be found towards the mid-game or potentially even to the early game if you want to run right to the Repcon facility, because I believe that's the first area where you can really pick up a bumper sword, at least the regular bumper sword. You could technically go to Lonesome Road and get one even earlier than that, and that would make your melee build exceptionally strong throughout pretty much all of the game. You could just use that and nothing else. But the bumper sword is a fairly rare weapon that generally super mutants have. There's not really a whole lot of other enemies that carry around bumper swords. Generally, it's just the super mutants and the Nightkin. So the regular bumper sword requires 50 melee in order to use, 8 strength to wield, so it is a very hefty weapon as you would kind of expect. I mean, this is a sword made out of part of a car, and it is wielded by super mutants, so kind of makes sense that it would have a high strength requirement to it. Not too bad on the melee requirement though. This one does 32 damage on hit, which is fairly decent, 46 damage per second. The bumper swords don't swing super fast as you would kind of expect from two-handed weapons. It's about the same as like the sledgehammer or the super sledge in terms of attack speed. This has 32 crit damage, so same as its regular damage, which is perfectly fine. A 1x crit modifier, so normal crits. This one does cost 38 action points to use in VATS, which is fairly high. The good news about this, though, is that all of the bumper swords have a really good melee attack when they're in VATS, where their unique attack once you have 50 melee is Mauler, and Mauler can knock down enemies instantly, which is really, really good. That is extremely strong, even more so if you combine it with other melee-related perks like Slayer and Super Slam, which can also give you knockdown. So this is pretty much guaranteed knockdowns in VATS, which is really good. This one does weigh 12, so it is a very heavy weapon as you would kind of expect, at least heavy for a melee weapon. Technically, you don't need to carry around more than one of these, so 12 weight isn't too bad, since you don't have to account for ammo. And the bumper sword has 300 item HP. The bumper sword does not break very fast at all, which is fantastic. For the general pros of the bumper sword, this one does have pretty good damage. It also has a very good VATS attack, and this one does just look cool in my opinion. I really like the aesthetic of it. This weapon fits really well. Is it the coolest looking sword? Not really, but it does fit the setting really, really well. I love, like, when we do have post-apocalyptic games like this, or something like Dying Light 2 that did this pretty well, in my opinion, was taking, like, junk items and turning them into weapons. I think the bumper sword kind of fits this really well, and it also fits really well thematically for a super mutant to have this, where they could have seen people like Caesar's Legion using blades, and decided that they're just going to rip off a giant hunk of steel and then grind it to where they can use it as a sword too, which makes sense. That would be something that, like, the, I guess, less intelligent super mutants might do. Lily, the companion, also has a bumper sword as well. Hers is a little bit different because hers is made from a vertibird blade. So it's made from a helicopter blade, which is kind of cool. You can't actually get that one unless you want to spawn it in with commands, so that one is just unique to Lily. For the cons of the bumper sword, this one is fairly heavy. They all weigh 12, so it's fairly heavy for a melee weapon, although that is heavy enough for heavyweight to cut it in half, so down to 6 isn't that big of a deal. And since the bumper swords are fairly rare, you're probably not going to be finding a whole lot of them, which also makes it so repairing them can be a little bit of a pain. Not such a big deal once you get jury rigging though, or if you just want to use weapon repair kits. These also have slow attacks, but that's not too bad. They're not one of the slowest attacking weapons in the game, and they do high damage per hit, as well as, since they're a two-handed weapon, they do have fairly long reach, and since they're a two-handed weapon, if you do have a perk like Super Slam, you can knock down enemies easier with them. So the cons aren't too bad for this. Let's also go over some perks that can help out the bumper sword and its unique variants. So the first perk would be heavyweight. This can cut its weight down in half since these all weigh over 10. They weigh 12, which would take it down to 6, making them a lot more lightweight, which is great. Slayer is fantastic since this gives you more attack speed, and it's really good on any melee build. Super Slam to knock down enemies, very good for two-handed melee. Purifier to kill things like Deathclaws and Super Mutants, also really good for weapons like this. And then Piercing Strike, which give you armor piercing. All of them are fantastic for a melee and unarmed build, and I'd recommend you take them all if you're running one of those builds. For an overall rating for the bumper sword, I think I'm going to put this one into B tier. I think it's fine enough for the most part. It's a pretty decent melee weapon, and if you're running a melee weapons build, if you get it early on enough, if you want to go to the Repcon facility and pick one of these up, it will serve you fairly well. You could also, you know, be using like the Rebar clubs that you find around there, which are decent enough too during the mid game. These will fall off later, but the unique versions of this don't really fall off. They're pretty strong. So let's talk about the Blade of the East up next, which this one is a unique weapon that is wielded by the Legate. Now the Blade of the East can only be obtained by killing the Legate and taking this, unless you want to spawn it in with commands. But if you do kill the Legate, then that means you're already at the very end of the game, and you're not really going to be able to use the Blade of the East against basically anything, sadly. Unless, of course, you have mods that make it so you can either get this early on, other enemies can have this, or you can extend the ending to where you can keep playing the game. So the regular Blade of the East of the game has very limited use because it is at the very end of the game where there's just nothing else for you to kill besides a couple NCR troopers, and that's about it. And I guess some Legion members that might be straggling after you killed the Legate. So this one requires 100 melee and 9 strength in order to wield, one of the highest requirements out of any weapon in the game. This one does 65 damage on hit, plus it also has a burning effect or a damage over time effect. That is 2 damage for 10 seconds, which can be pretty good. And this is similar to like the Shishkebab, although the Blade of the East isn't affected by like Pyromaniac, since this isn't technically a fire weapon. This one does 98 damage per second, which is fairly good for a melee weapon, and then it does the additional damage over time, so you might be getting a little bit more out of that. This one has 30 crit damage, fairly low crit damage for some reason, less than the Bumper Sword. The Bumper Sword actually has the highest amount of crit damage out of these for some odd reason. This has a 1-time crit modifier, costs 35 action points. This one weighs 12, and the Blade of the East has 800 item health. So it takes a very long time to break this weapon. Like I said, there is some obvious cons to this though, and that is that it's at the very end of the game. You're not going to get it until the very end of the game. So using it is not really going to be all that viable for the most part. This one I would say is quite a bit better than the regular Bumper Sword, and I would move this one up into S tier. It's a really cool item, even though it basically is unusable. So you could also say that this one's F tier because it is at the very end of the game naturally, and if you're playing on like console and you don't have a way to mod this into the game, then you're just not really going to get to use it at all. So could go to either extreme. It's a very strong weapon if you do get to use it, but it's a fairly weak weapon in the grand scheme of Fallout New Vegas because of its very limited use. Let's move on to the Blade of the West now. The Blade of the West is not really a unique weapon. It's unique to the Divide, but you can get this on multiple marked men. So the Blade of the West is very similar to the Blade of the East. This one requires 100 melee and 9 strength to wield, same as the Blade of the East. This one does 60 damage on hit, so quite high damage, 128 damage per second. This one swings the fastest out of any of the Bumper Swords, which is really cool. This one does 30 crit damage, which is also kind of low, half of its normal damage, but that is kind of common for some melee weapons. This one has a 1.5 times crit modifier, so you're more likely to hit crits with this, which is pretty good. This one costs the least amount of action points at 29, making it for a decent two-handed melee weapon. Most two-handed melee weapons generally fall around the 30-point range for action points, so this one is fairly normal. This one also weighs 12. This one does have a lot less item health than the other Bumper Swords, though, at 150. That's still pretty high for most melee weapons, and once you have jury rigging, this one's going to be super easy to take care of. So it has enough item health to where it's not going to be breaking super quick. This one also has a unique ability added on where it has knockdown on crit. So you have another way to knock down enemies, and if you have Super Slam, you have a way to knock down enemies, and you also have Mauler in this, so you have another way to knock down enemies. If an enemy is knocked down, that means it can't be attacking you, which makes it so that you can fight just about anything one-on-one with a melee build just in general. But the Blade of the West is particularly good at doing this, and the Blade of the West I think is one of the best melee weapons in the game. I'm going to put this one all the way up into S tier. It's also one of the coolest looking weapons in my opinion, and again, if you do want to run to the Lonesome Road right away, kill one of the marked men, or pick this up off of a body, you absolutely can do that, and then you'll have an incredibly strong melee weapon for the rest of your run. So that'll do it for the Bumper Swords. They are a very cool weapon, very unique. I wish there was more weapons like this in some of the other Fallout games. We don't really get a whole lot of super mutant melee weapons. Most of the time it's like wooden boards or like sledgehammers, sometimes super sledges, and that's about it, which I think those are fitting too. But I would like to see more bladed weapons that the super mutants wield, because could you imagine like a super mutant knife and it just being like a full-size sword for you? That'd be really cool to see too. Today we're going to be taking a look at the axe. All three versions of the axe, or I guess the two variants of the axe plus the unique version of the fire axe. So there are three, at least, regular swinging axes in the game, not counting all the throwing axes, which we've already talked about. So we're going to be going over those and how strong they are, what type of perks work with them, and all that good stuff. Let's start out with the Hatchet first. The Hatchet is the one-handed axe that is probably the most rare version of the axe. I don't know why that is. It seems like really only fiends carry around hatchets, at least in the base game. I think you can potentially get them from like the lobotomites at low levels in Old World Blues, but they might be the only other ones that actually have this. So the Hatchet requires 25 melee and 2 strength to wield. Not very much melee, not very much strength. This one does 16 damage per hit, which is okay for a one-handed melee weapon. It's not incredible, but it's alright. This does 41 damage per second. The hatchet does actually attack fairly fast, which is nice. Does 16 crit damage, which is okay. Has a 1x crit modifier, also okay. Costs 22 action points to use in VATS, which is a little bit high for a melee weapon. It's not super high. You can still get quite a few hits in with that, but it's not as good as some other one-handed melee weapons that you might be able to get by the time you could get a hatchet. This one weighs 2 weight overall, and it has 300 item health, which makes it very durable. That's actually something that is really good for the hatchet. It, just like all the other melee weapons, has its own unique VATS attack. For the hatchet, this is backslash, which is the same as like the knives, same as a lot of the one-handed bladed weapons, and this VATS attack is fine. It makes it so you can hit things for less action points, and I think it makes so you do slightly less damage, which is okay. The hatchet also has a unique effect on it, similar to the machete, where it gets an extra 1.5 times limb damage on it, so you can break limbs even quicker with the hatchet, which is pretty cool. That makes it so you can do even more damage overall, and it can make it so if you tear off a limb from an enemy, you can just kill them a little bit quicker than you would otherwise, assuming that you just don't outright kill them with the hatchet. Let's go over the pros, the cons, and then the perks for this too, and then we'll rank the hatchet and we'll move on to the fire axe, because there is at least one perk that helps out with this weapon that doesn't help out with the fire axes. So for the general pros of the fire axes and the hatchet overall, at least the axes do really good damage and have really good damage per second. The hatchet has okay damage and okay damage per second, but it does have high item health, so that is actually pretty good. The cons to these weapons are all that they're fairly rare though. Fire axes are going to be the easiest one to get. There are a couple locations that you can get fire axes on, especially early on if you're willing to do it. If you go directly above Good Springs where you have that area with the cazadors, there are going to be corpses there that have fire axes, which make it so you can make pretty good money because fire axes are worth a lot, or you can have a really strong melee weapon to begin with. If you go to like the fire station in Camp Searchlight, then there's going to be fire axes on the walls that you can always get to. That's also where the unique fire axe is, so that's pretty awesome. For hatchets, you're basically going to have to either go to Old World Blues early and take them off the lobotomites, or you're going to have to go and fight fiends early on, and that could potentially get you some axes too, which is kind of nice. The hatchet also counts as a holdout weapon too. I believe it's a 50 sneak holdout weapon, but you can sneak the hatchet into areas. As for the perks that can help out with the hatchet and the fire axes, Slayer is really good because it gets you increased attack speed, Super Slam so you can knock down enemies, that's just really strong with melee in general, Purifier so you do extra damage towards things like Deathclaws and Super Mutants, Piercing Strike so you can punch through armor, which is always good, and then Cowboy in particular helps out the hatchet because that is something that is actually affected by the Cowboy perk, so you can get an extra 25% more damage, which does make the hatchet substantially better than it would be otherwise, since it has okay stats overall, and at least buffing up its damage makes it so it has a little bit above average stats, I guess, for a one-handed melee weapon by the time you're getting it. And the main problem is you could just get something like Chance's Knife, which also gets a bonus from something like Cowboy, and is just flat out better than the hatchet overall anyway. There is kind of that, but that's not really fair. We always talk about Chance's Knife since it's just one of the strongest early game weapons. For an overall rating for the hatchet, I think I'd put this one up into B tier on my tier list. I think it's okay so long as you have the Cowboy perk. It's not incredible. It's not going to be like one of the most standout melee weapons, but I do know a lot of people really liking this just because it is something that's kind of unique and kind of hard to get. As well as I know there's plenty of people that don't even know the hatchet exists whenever I talk about this or any of the throwing like hatchet versions besides I guess the Proton Axes, where it's like, yeah, these are fairly rare, but you can get them and they can be pretty decent. Let's move on to the Fire Axe next and talk about that and its unique variant. So the Fire Axe requires more strength and more melee than the hatchet does. This one requires 75 melee and 5 strength in order to wield. Not the hardest thing in the world to get for a melee build, so you can actually get these pretty early on and use them pretty effectively. The Fire Axe does 55 damage per hit. It does a lot of damage per hit, which is really good. 87 damage per second. These don't swing the fastest, but they still swing fairly fast for a two-handed melee weapon. This one does 27 crit damage. Similar to other two-handed melee weapons, it does half the amount of crit damage as its regular damage, like the Super Sledge does too. I don't know why they decided to do that, but it's okay. This one has a 1x crit modifier, so average crits. Costs 22 action points, the same as the hatchet, weirdly enough. I don't know why that is, but it's an okay amount of action points for the weapon that you're using. Fire axes weigh 8 weight, so they are a little bit heavy, but since it is a melee weapon, you don't really need to carry around anything more. And if you have like jury rigging, you can fix this with literally any two-handed melee option. So if you find pool cues or nail boards or anything like that, you can fix it right up. And then the fire axe has 200 item health, so it doesn't break very fast either. The fire axe is just a very solid all-around melee weapon that can kind of do everything pretty well, and has even more pros than something like the hatchet does. It also has a different unique VATS attack, where both the fire axe and Knock Knock have the Mauler attack, which the Mauler attack is probably the best VATS attack that you can have for a melee weapon, since you can knock enemies down with it, and that makes it really easy for you just to wail on them afterwards. This combined with like Super Slam is really strong overall. The fire axe is just a really great weapon. I would put it up into A tier. I think the fire axe is actually a really decent melee weapon that's really good at anything, and I know it's plenty of people's favorite like melee weapon to be using, and I can totally understand why. It is really, really fun and really satisfying. Now, there is still the unique version of the fire axe, and that is called Knock Knock. This one can be found in Camp Searchlight. It is found in the fire station. It is found on the second floor of the fire station, and you do have to do either part of a quest for this, or you have to kill Logan, who has the keys to both the police station and the fire station, in order to get into there. Once you get into there, there is a Rad Scorpion Queen, so you're going to have to deal with that, as well as some other Rad Scorpions. And the place is full of radiation, so make sure you take your Rad-X and Rad-Away while you're in there. And then you have to go to the second floor. It's found in the bathroom, and it's found in a stall, and it's just hidden up against the stall. It's kind of one of the more difficult, unique weapons to find, especially if you weren't aware that it was already there. So it's going to be really difficult for you to accidentally stumble upon Knock Knock. But if you do, then you get a really cool axe. This one is a reference to The Shining with Knock Knock. I like to think that it's more of a reference to American Psycho with the way that it looks, though. So you can cosplay as Patrick Bateman if you would like, and just go on an axe murder spree, which is really fun. This one requires 75 melee as well to wield, and 5 strength, same as the regular fire axe. This one does more damage at 66 damage per hit, which is quite high. This one does 119 damage per second, which is really good. Has a 33 crit damage to it, so half of its regular damage is crit damage, which again is kind of weird for this weapon and other melee weapons, but it's okay. It's still a decent amount of damage. 1 times crit modifier. This one costs less action points at 21 rather than 22 like the others. I don't know why that is, but it is kind of nice that it does do that. This one weighs 8, and weirdly enough, Knock Knock is one of the unique weapons that actually has less item health than its regular counterpart, where Knock Knock only has 110 item health rather than the 200 that the regular fire axes do. This one, I would say, is generally better than the regular fire axe, and once you have jury rigging, the item health really doesn't matter because you could fix it again with pool cues or whatever. And Knock Knock is a very solid option, and probably one of my absolute favorite options for a melee weapon. I think I'd put this one up into S tier, but it is on the low end of S tier, bordering on A tier. I don't think it's one of the strongest melee weapons in the game, but I mean, I have to give some respect to Knock Knock because it's always one of my go-to weapons in the game, and it's so nice to use. Feels really strong. Doesn't necessarily feel overpowered, but feels really strong regardless. So that'll do it for the hatchet and the fire axes. Tell me your thoughts on them down in the comments below. How do you like using them? Does anybody here use the hatchet at all as like a weapon that they're going to use? I haven't really heard many like cowboy builds using it either. I'd be curious if you do. Axes that are available in Old World Blues. These are not necessarily the only axes that are available there, because you can get some throwing ones which you can use to fix up these ones, which is pretty awesome. These ones are available pretty early on into that DLC, and if you want to rush these, they can be fantastic melee weapons, because this is basically just an upgrade to a fire axe, which I already consider a really strong melee weapon. So the Proton Axe is generally carried by the various lobotomites, and this is carried at all levels. So even if you want to go there at a very early level, you can pick these up pretty easily. The Proton Axe requires 50 melee and 5 strength in order to wield, so average stats all the way across the board should be pretty doable for a melee build, especially if you want to rush there right away. And this one does 50 damage per hit, which is quite good, 96 damage per second, which is also quite good. These do attack fairly fast. This has 25 crit damage, half of its regular damage. A lot of two-handed melee weapons have this for some reason. This has a 1 times crit modifier, so normal crits. This one only costs 22 action points to use in VATS, making it a very good VATS weapon, and it does have its own unique VATS attack, which is pretty cool. This is available once you have 50 melee and you go into VATS. For the Proton Axe, this is called Proton Electrocutioner. I do really like that name. That is a really good name for this. On top of that, this only costs a slight bit more action points to use and deals double melee damage inside there, which melee already deals extra damage in VATS. So you're dealing even more damage, making it so for a VATS weapon, this one is really, really good. This one weighs 8 weight, so it's not super heavy. This has 200 item health, which I believe is better than a regular fire axe. It's at least better than the unique version of the fire axe in terms of overall health. So that's pretty good. As well as this does have an additional effect on top of that. Since this is an electrocuting weapon, this deals extra damage towards robots and power armor. This is 50 extra damage towards robots outside of Old World Blues, 20 damage to robots inside Old World Blues, and 20 damage to power armor enemies. So this one is very good at fighting robots. For the pros of the Proton Axe, this one does do high damage and high damage per second. That is really nice. Fire axes just in general are very solid melee weapons for just about any sort of role. This does extra robot damage and extra power armor damage, so if you're fighting those type of enemies, that one can also be really nice. And this one has a really good VATS attack, so it has a lot going for it for a melee weapon. For the cons, the only real con to either of these weapons, outside of them just being melee and the natural cons that come with that, is that they're DLC weapons. You do have to go to Old World Blues in order to get them. But aside from that, they're quite good. They have good item health, they have good damage, they have good stats all the way around, they work really well as a general purpose weapon. There is also quite a few perks that we should talk about. So we have the standard perks that help out all of these weapons, at least for a melee and an unarmed build. So we've got Slayer to attack faster, which is really good. Super Slam to knock down enemies, that's even better with two-handed weapons like this one because it's more likely to trigger. Piercing Strike to punch through armor, because why not, you might as well. And Purifier to kill things like Deathclaws and Super Mutants a little bit easier. All of them are fantastic on the Proton Axe and on just any melee build. So for an overall rating for the Proton Axe, I'd put this thing up into A tier. I think it's a very solid weapon. It's just a straight upgrade to the axe, and I consider the axe already like a very solid A tier weapon as well. This one I would consider even more so, and even considering the special attack, where the axe does have Mauler, you could argue Mauler is better than this one. This one will do more damage, but Mauler is guaranteed knockdown, so they both have their pros and cons, but I think this one is a little bit better than a regular axe overall. Let's talk about the unique one, where you can actually get multiple unique Proton Axes in this. So you can get the Protonic Inverse Axe from a few enemies that have this, and a few locations that are around the map. Like there's one inside of the school. If you go through the hard-locked door, I believe, then you can find one on a corpse. If you go into the Cuckoo's Nest, you can find one on the named lobotomite there. They use it, and I think there's one or two other ones that you can get. This one can also be fixed up with the throwing axes as well, so that's really nice. This one, just like a lot of the Old World Blues weapons, has a weird requirement at 55 melee and 5 strength. Don't know why you need 5 extra melee, but there you go. You'll probably have it if you're going for this type of weapon. This one does 58 damage on hit, which is a bit higher than the regular axe. This one has 111 damage per second, 45 crit damage. This one actually doesn't suffer from as much crit damage loss as a regular axe, which is really good. 1x crit modifier. This one does cost slightly more action points at 25, as well as this one has its own unique VATS attack in it too, which is called the Inversal Scarifier. I don't think that's a real word, but I do like the name, so that one's pretty cool. This one also weighs 8 and has 250 item health, a little bit more item health than the regular Proton Axe. This one still has the bonus effect, though, of dealing extra damage towards robots and power armor enemies. So this one I would just consider a straight upgrade to the regular axe, and I would consider this one of the best melee weapons in the game. I would put this one all the way up into S tier. I think it's really good. If you want a very solid early game melee weapon, you can rush right to Old World Blues and do this right away. You don't need to be particularly high level to do that DLC, potentially even more so with a melee build because you're not as reliant on ammo. So yeah, the inverse axe is really, really nice. The regular axe is also really good. And that'll do it for both these axes. Tell me your thoughts on these. I think that they're pretty cool weapons. They're probably some of my favorite weapons, especially once I get to Old World Blues. I always like going to Old World Blues without any sort of equipment. I usually do that with most of the DLCs and just use whatever we get there. And like the Proton Axe or the Inverse Axe is always a go-to weapon that I use for the majority of this because it works so well against the Robo Scorpions and it works so well against the Lobotomites most of the time. Oh, and the Night Stalkers. Today we're going to be taking a look at one of the more brutal weapons in Fallout. This is going to be the Ripper and the Chainsaw, because the Chainsaw is kind of just an upscaled version of the Ripper, or I guess other way around if you want to look at it like that. So the Ripper has been in basically every single Fallout game. I think that it has. I haven't played 76 still, so it might not be in that one, but I'm pretty sure it's in the first one, it's in the second one, it's in Tactics, in the third one, in the fourth one. So the Ripper has been around for quite a while, and this is a little portable handheld chainsaw. We've even seen it in the TV show too, which is pretty cool. So the Ripper you can actually get fairly early on too. You might actually be able to get this as soon as you get down to Nipton, because if you're willing to kill the Legion commander there, you can take a Ripper off of his body, and Rippers actually aren't too hard to find, at least some of the time throughout New Vegas, and they do make for a pretty decent early game melee weapon, or a mid game melee weapon. You can also buy these from the Gunrunners. Both of these weapons you can actually buy from the Gunrunners because they both have a Gunrunners Arsenal version of them, which can accept mods. The regular versions can't. At least I don't think so. Maybe there was one for the Chainsaw. I can't remember though. If so, I think it's just a lightweight frame, which is still useful for it, but not as useful as like getting a Gunrunner's Arsenal version where you can mod it out even further. So the Ripper requires 50 melee weapons and 3 strength to wield, which is fairly low for a melee weapon. You don't actually need to have that much strength, which is pretty awesome. This one does 50 damage per hit, which is fairly high, 50 damage per second, which damage and damage per second are basically the same for this weapon, and same with like the chainsaw and the Thermic lance too, because he's hit multiple times in quick succession. It's very similar to the industrial hand, which we talked about not too long ago. The Ripper has a big old 5 for crit damage, so not very high, although that makes sense for a weapon that hits this often. I think the only one that actually has a high crit damage is the industrial hand. The Ripper, the chainsaw, and the Thermic lance, not as much. This one has a 1x crit modifier, which can be fine because this hits more often than other melee weapons, so it's more likely to hit crits, even though its crits aren't very high, which makes it so if you want to build a crit melee build, this one can work, or if you want to go in the exact opposite direction and not go with any crits and go with something like heavy-handed as a trait, then the Ripper does actually work quite well in that sort of build. This one requires 65 action points to use in VATS, a lot of action points. These type of weapons just aren't really the best to be using in VATS. It does have a unique VATS attack, just like all the melee weapons, that's called Long Cut. This one is okay overall. I don't really see it as that much of an advantage over the regular Ripper attack, and neither one of them are way great in VATS. The Ripper weighs 6 weight, so it's not super heavy, not the lightest melee weapon, but not super heavy either. This one has 1200 item health, so a lot of health. This actually takes a very long time to break, since even though this is hitting multiple times really fast, it still doesn't break super quick. That's still a lot of health for it. And then the effect of both the Ripper and the chainsaw is that they both ignore damage resistance and damage threshold. So it doesn't matter whether you're fighting the biggest, baddest armored enemy in the game, or if you're fighting a non-armored enemy, you're going to be doing the same amount of damage regardless, and the same amount of damage per second, which does make it so these weapons are uniquely good against fighting certain types of enemies like the giant rad scorpions, Brotherhood members, other heavily armored enemies too, Deathclaws as well, where you don't have to worry about their armor. For the general pros of the Ripper and the chainsaw, these ones both do really high damage and really high damage per second. If you can just stand there and keep hitting something with the chainsaw or with the Ripper, you're gonna be killing it very, very fast. It doesn't really matter what it is. And even though they have really high item HP, it can actually go even higher with the mods, so they don't break very fast either, which is really cool. I guess another pro to this is that they are Gunrunner's Arsenal versions, so you can buy them from other vendors throughout the wasteland. So you might be able to get a Gunrunner's Arsenal chainsaw or a Ripper really early on, as opposed to some other weapons that you might not be able to do that with. You can do kind of the same thing with like the baseball bat or the katana, which are also really good early game melee weapons and even really good late game melee weapons. The cons to these though are that they have very high action point costs and they're not really the best to be using in VATS. The chainsaw has a little bit of an exception with that, with its unique ability called Scrap Heap, but that's because it does less damage, but it also takes less action points, so it's not as bad in VATS. The Ripper isn't really the greatest in VATS though, and the regular chainsaw just hitting normal attacks also isn't necessarily the best, although it's not terrible for closing distance quickly though either. And they both have low crit damage, so hitting crits with these, you may not actually benefit that much from a melee crit build. It still wouldn't be bad with these because you can still rack up the damage per second just thanks to that build. But you could also go with a non-crit build and just go for a melee damage build, and these ones can also work really well. For an overall rating for the Ripper, I think I'd probably put this one into B tier on my tier list. This weapon, I'm just going to say up front though, is not really my type of weapon. I usually don't go for the Ripper. I think it's cool and I do like it, but it's not one of my favorite like one-handed melee weapons. I'll usually go with something like Blood Nap or the Bowie Knife or Chance's Knife or something like that over it, or maybe the War Club over something like the Ripper. We do have a modified version of the Ripper that we need to talk about too though. So if you do have the Gunrunner's Arsenal version of the Ripper, you can actually put 2 mods on this. You can put the heavy duty chain on this, which increases the durability of the Ripper by 50%. So it goes from that 1200 total item HP up to 1800 item HP, making it so it takes forever to break. The Ripper actually lasts a very long time if you want to do this. And then the other one that I would say is more important for the Ripper is the Carbide Teeth. These ones give you an additional 10 base damage to the Ripper, so you go from a base damage of 50 all the way up to 60. Modified Ripper is going up into A tier. I think it's actually even better than the regular one, and it's a pretty decent melee weapon overall. Let's talk about perks right now too that can help out these weapons. So we've already went over heavy-handed. That's not really a perk, it's a trait, but it is something that you could take, and these are weapons that you could consider for that build, and it can work quite well. Slayer also helps out with these, where you get higher damage per second because it still affects the attack speed, which can be really useful. And Heavyweight affects the chainsaw itself, since it is a fairly heavy weapon and it can have its weight cut in half, so that's pretty nice. You could also take Purifier, which gives you more damage against certain enemy types too. That one's really nice. Piercing Strike isn't really necessary for these weapons because they already punch through armor, but Piercing Strike is really good for a melee or an unarmed build, so I would recommend that one. And Super Slam doesn't really work with these ones either. You don't usually knock down enemies. Let's move over to the Chainsaw now, which the Chainsaw is a pretty cool weapon. You can find this throughout New Vegas too. There are a couple enemies that can carry around chainsaws. Legion hit squads usually carry this around, or the Thermic Lance around. The Legion members themselves can carry around chainsaws too. They're probably going to be the most likely enemies to be carrying them around. And at least the Fiend Leader Motor Runner also has a chainsaw on him, so you can take that off of him at any time if you want to go to that vault and take care of him. The chainsaw requires 75 melee and 7 strength to wield, so fairly high, but not actually one of the highest of the melee weapons. This one does 80 damage and 80 damage per second. This is very similar to the Ripper, where you just want to hold this on to enemies, so it's going to do similar damage. This one has a big old 8 for crit damage, so a bit higher if you're hitting crits with the chainsaw, but still not very high. 1 times crit modifier, which is perfectly fine. This one also requires 65 action points to use. Scrap Heap, its unique attack, requires half of that, so it is better to be using, but it also does half the damage, which makes it okay to be using with the chainsaw in VATS. It's still not one of the best VATS weapons, but it's okay enough then. The chainsaw weighs 20 weight, so it is very heavy. This can be cut down with heavy weight, which would cut it down to 10 weight. And this has 1600 item HP, so it already has more item HP than the Ripper. This one also ignores damage threshold and damage resist, same as the Ripper, which is really useful. And I find that the chainsaw is just pretty much an upgrade from the Ripper. It's also one of my more favorite melee weapons to be using. Also, if you're a fan of like Texas Chainsaw, you could be running around as a real-life Leatherface with the chainsaw. Even if the real-life Leatherface that one's based off never used a chainsaw, but whatever. The regular chainsaw, I think I'd put pretty high up into my tier list. I'd put this one right onto S tier. It's pretty good. Let's talk about the modded version of the chainsaw now, which again is a Gunrunner's Arsenal version, so you can get 3 mods for the chainsaw as well. These ones you can buy at all sorts of different vendors, which can be really, really useful too, because you can get those potentially early on. I find a lot of vendors actually sell the chainsaw unique parts to them, but not every vendor will actually sell the chainsaw to you, so you might be able to actually accumulate all of the parts, all the mods for your chainsaw before you actually get the chainsaw. The 3 mods that you can get are the Chainsaw Alloy Frame. This one drops the weight from 20 down to 12, drops it by 8. This can still be cut in half by heavyweight though, and actually go to the same weight as the Ripper, so it is also just 6 weight, which makes it so the chainsaw is actually fairly light and handy to be carrying around. You also have the Carbide Teeth for the chainsaw, similar to the Ripper. This one gives you a plus 15 in base damage, so you go from the 80 base damage up to 95 base damage, which is a really big bonus. That one's actually really nice. And then the very last one that you can get is a heavy duty chain. Also, just like the Ripper, this one gives you 50% more item durability. So you go from 1600 item durability all the way up to 2400 item durability, making the chainsaw one of the most durable weapons in the entire game. Now, it will still potentially break quicker than other weapons just because of how often you're hitting with it, but it still takes a very, very long time for the chainsaw to actually break down. All of these just make the chainsaw overall better, and I'd put this also up into S tier, but just higher up into S tier than the regular chainsaw. These are some very fun and very brutal weapons that you can be taking around the wasteland. I know a lot of people really like the chainsaw. Some people really like the Ripper, and I like the look of it. I just don't really care for the feel of it. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Thermic Lance. We're also going to be taking a look at 2 other spears, this being the Knife Spear and the Clean Knife Spear, because otherwise that would be kind of weird to have them all ranked as like their own weapons. So let's talk about the Knife Spear first. This is one of the weapons that you can find in Dead Money. This is a weapon that the ghost people tend to have. You can take it off of them. You can fix this with just the throwing Knife Spear, which is pretty awesome. It makes it so you always have a Knife Spear available in Dead Money. This one requires 25 melee and 2 strength in order to wield. This one does 20 damage on hit, which is okay, not the highest amount of damage. 38 damage per second. This one doesn't swing super fast. This one does 20 crit damage, which is the same as its regular damage, has a 1 times crit modifier. This one does cost a decent amount of action points at 35, but it does have one of the best VATS attacks in the game since it has Mauler, which Mauler is a guaranteed knockdown once you have 50 melee, so that's really cool. If you want to use that in VATS, it can be quite strong, especially against the ghost people, more so if you're fighting one-on-one. Because you can knock them down, then you can just keep smacking them with the Knife Spear. This one weighs 3 weight, so it's fairly lightweight. Has 400 item HP. The Knife Spears do not break fast at all, which is awesome. That actually gives them a decent amount of health if you're going to be running through Dead Money with a melee build. And these ones do have an extra bonus on them. Since they are a Dead Money weapon made to be fighting the ghost people, they have extra limb damage. So this is 1.5 times extra limb damage. This is good, especially against the ghost people, where the extra limb damage can make it so you can tear their limbs off easier. And if you tear off the limbs of the ghost people, then you kill them. It's actually the only way to kill the ghost people, but sometimes you can just break a limb off right away, and that'll make it so you can just flat out kill them, which is pretty cool. The knife spear also looks kind of interesting. I like the way it looks, where it's like a broom handle that has just 4 kitchen knives just roped around it and held in place. I do kind of like makeshift weapons like this, particularly melee weapons, because I think they fit really well. For the pros of this weapon, we're going to have separate pros and cons for the knife spear and for the thermic lance since they function so differently. But the pros for the knife spear and the clean version are that it has pretty high health. These don't break very fast, which is pretty awesome. They're also very easy to fix if they are breaking, because you can just get the throwing knife spear and fix them. A lot of the ghost people tend to carry those too. It does have the extra limb damage, which is pretty nice, especially in dead money. This is still sadly not going to be the best melee or unarmed weapon to be using in dead money. Technically, the best is the Fist of Rar. That is going out of your way to get that before you go to Dead Money. In Dead Money, the Bear Trap Fist is still the better option for a melee or unarmed build because of all the extra limb damage that it has, so you can tear off limbs much easier with that one, especially in VATS if you have high unarmed. This one does have a good VATS attack, though. That's another big pro of this one. Mauler is one of the best VATS attacks in the game, so that's pretty awesome. Major con to the Knife Spear and the Clean version is just kind of has low stats. If you go to take it from Dead Money into the Wasteland, it's going to be okay, but it's not going to be an amazing melee weapon. It's going to be on par with a lot of early game melee weapons. So that's alright, or even maybe into the mid game, where this one isn't going to be as strong as some of the weapons that you could get, especially if you're going to any of the DLCs at a fairly high level. There are quite a few perks that help out with these weapons too. So there is Heavyweight. Heavyweight will only affect the Thermic Lance. It won't affect the other knife spears. So that one's kind of nice if you don't want to carry around as much weight. Super Slam is really good with these weapons since you can knock down enemies, and that's just fantastic. Slayer to attack faster is really good. Purifier to kill certain enemies like Super Mutants or Death Claws is pretty nice. Heavy-handed is a decent trait if you want to be taking it with these, because they don't do the most crit damage, so they can actually be decent for that. Running crits on these melee builds is also quite strong, so either way, it depends on how you want to play. Low luck character or a high luck character. If you're going high luck, don't pick heavy-handed. If you're going low luck, heavy-handed can be pretty good. And then Piercing Strike helps out these two since you can punch through more armor. Not with the Thermic Lance since it already basically does that by default, but with these weapons it does, so that's pretty good. As for a rating for the Knife Spear, I think I'd put this one into C tier. The regular Knife Spear is decent enough. It's an okay melee weapon that kind of does okay at everything. It's not crazy by any means, but if you do run to Dead Money and you're going with a melee build, the Knife Spear is alright for the start. You may want to swap it out for the Cosmic Knife. The Cosmic Knife does have a couple other versions since it has the clean version and the superheated version. The superheated version's decent. I think the clean version is the best of those knives, but it is an option. And then we have the Knife Spear Clean, which you can make this at different workstations, which is pretty cool. So the Clean Knife Spear has similar stats to the regular Knife Spear, where this one also costs 25 melee and 2 strength in order to wield. This one does more damage at 25 damage per hit, 47 damage per second, which is okay damage per second and okay damage. This one also has 25 crit damage on it. This one has a higher crit chance modifier though at 1.2 times, which is pretty good. More crits is always good. This one requires 35 action points using VATS as well. This one also weighs 3, has 400 item health. The main difference between this one and the regular Knife Spear is that it has 3 times limb damage rather than the 1.5 times limb damage. So this one's even better against the ghost people, and it makes it so tearing off limbs is potentially even easier than it would be otherwise. That is actually pretty nice. I would say the Clean Knife Spear is a straight upgrade from the regular Knife Spear. It also just looks a little bit nicer since you have the Cosmic Knife Clean on there, and those ones do look kind of cool. I do like the look of them. Aside from that, it still has all the same pros and cons of the regular Knife Spear, just with slightly higher crit chance and better limb damage. It still has Mauler as its VATS attack though, so that's pretty good. For an overall rating for the Clean Knife Spear, I would move that one a tier up higher into B tier. Probably on the low end of B tier, maybe the high end of C tier. It is better than the regular Knife Spear, but I don't know if it would be way great outside of Dead Money for other weapons, for other melee weapons, because honestly, I only ever use the Knife Spear in Dead Money. There are just better melee weapons that you can find in the Wasteland, especially like two-handed melee weapons that I just prefer to use over this one. Now let's move on to the Thermic Lance. So the Thermic Lance is a pretty cool weapon. This is very similar to the Chainsaw. This is one of the automatic melee weapons, similar to the Chainsaw or the Ripper, where you just hold this out and it keeps hitting enemies, which does make it so it goes through health pretty quick and it attacks pretty fast. Also, just like those weapons, it does have the unique ability of ignoring damage resist and damage threshold, which is really, really good. So the Thermic Lance requires requires 100 melee in order to wield and 7 strength. It is a lot of strength and a lot of melee. This is considered an endgame weapon. There are a few enemies that can have Thermic Lances, like I think Hit Squats can have them, and I believe the Marked Men can have Thermic Lances. You probably won't be getting Thermic Lances off of enemies. You might if you're late into the game, then they can be spawning with them. But usually for me, I end up buying the Thermic Lance from like the Brotherhood. The Brotherhood can sell these, which is pretty cool. Thermic Lance does 100 damage on hit, 100 damage per second. This is because it's an automatic weapon, so you're constantly hitting stuff. This has 10 crit damage, which is actually pretty high for an automatic weapon like this. This one has a 1x crit modifier, which is pretty decent, especially for a weapon that's automatic. Most other weapons that are automatic have low crit chances, besides melee and unarmed. This one does cost a lot of action points though, at 65. This one also has the unique VATS attack of Scrap Heap. So this is the same one that the chainsaw has, where it does less damage, but it costs less action points to use. That can be kind of nice. I would say that the Thermic Lance and the chainsaw weapons like it just aren't very good for a VATS build. Although VATS with melee and unarmed is really good, you just may not want to be using this for your close range weapon that you're going to be using VATS with. I think this one benefits more from just stabbing stuff normally. This one weighs 20 weight, so it is pretty heavy. That does make it so it can get cut in half with heavy weight, and that will take it down to 10, so that's pretty good. That's a lot more manageable. Although you may not need to be carrying around multiple Thermic Lances. One is usually good enough, and you're probably not going to be finding multiple Thermic Lances. Again, you might, but maybe not. And this one has 2,000 item health, so quite a lot of item health. Let's go over the pros and cons for the Thermic Lance too. Now, so the pros to the Thermic Lance are that it has really high item HP. Even for a full auto weapon, this is still a lot of item HP. It doesn't break it very fast. And by the time you're getting Thermic Lances, you can probably get the perk Jury Rigging, which is pretty cool. So then you can just fix this with any two-handed melee weapon. So pool cues can fix up this, which is really, really good. This one also has really high damage and really high damage per second. This is some of the highest amounts of damage per second that any melee weapon can have. So the Thermic Lance is really good at killing things very fast. It also has the ignores damage resistance and damage threshold, so it doesn't matter what armor the enemies have, you're going to be doing the same damage regardless. The cons to the Thermic Lance are kind of the ones that you'd expect. This is fairly rare. You're probably not going to find one. You're probably going to have to buy one. So it's going to cost you some amount of money. Probably not a ton of money, depending on how high your barter skill is and when you go to get this. You'll probably be able to buy one without too much trouble. And this one is fairly heavy. 20 weight is quite a lot of weight, but with melee, that might not be such a big deal since you don't need multiple of these to fix them up, especially once you have Jury Rigging or if you have weapon repair kits where you can fix them up normally. Thermic Lance, I think, is one of the best melee weapons in the game, and I would put it all the way up into S tier. And that'll do it for these weapons. Thank you guys so very much for watching this. I hope that you guys enjoyed it. And this one has been requested quite a bit, at least Thermic Lance. I just didn't know if I wanted to do Thermic Lance by itself or with something else, and I figured the knife spears were kind of close enough to that so that we could kind of bundle all of these into one episode. Today we're going to be taking a look at some super mutant melee weapons. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Nailboard, the Rebar Club, and the Nuka Breaker, which is the unique version of the Rebar Club, even though it doesn't look anything like the Rebar Club and you have to buy it. Either way, let's talk about each of these. First up, we have the Nailboard, and then we'll go over that. We'll also go over pros and cons together, similar to like what we did in the last video with the unarmed, so it's going to get a little bit weird when we get there, but we'll get through it. So, very first up, we have the Nailboard. The Nailboard requires 25 melee and 7 strength to wield. It requires a lot of strength to wield this. Not very much melee though, and if you're going to the melee build, you probably have those stats and you can get them really early on. The Nailboard does 25 damage on hit, which is okay. It's not the most amount of damage, not very much for a two-handed weapon, but it's alright. This one does 36 damage per second, which is okay as well. Not really the highest, but it's alright. This does 25 crit damage, also alright, same as its regular damage. This on the wiki says that it has a 0x crit modifier. I don't think that's true. It might be below 1x though, to where you can still hit crits, but it's even less likely. I don't know why that is, but the crit chance is fairly low with this weapon. This one costs 27 action points in VATS, which isn't terrible. That's actually okay. This one weighs 4, which is alright as well, and this one has 60 item health. So its item health is very low. The Nailboard itself can break really fast. Nailboards are also one of the most rare weapons to actually find in New Vegas, which is a bit strange. About the only enemy that actually carries these are like low-leveled super mutants, and there's just not a whole lot of super mutants in New Vegas, so by the time you are fighting them, you're probably not going to be very low-leveled. You're probably going to be mid-leveled or high-leveled when you do fight them, so they likely won't even carry this. They'll probably be carrying around things like sledgehammers, rebar clubs, or super sledges depending on the level that you do fight them. There is also unique VATS attacks for each of these, just like all the melee weapons, but each of these are different. The Nailboard gets Grand Slam, the same as the baseball bat, which is actually really good. That's one of the best VATS attacks in the entire game. It's just that the Nailboard can't use it as well as something like the baseball bat. where the baseball bat is far more versatile than this. It's a lot easier to get early on, and it has mods that can go with it, which just make it way better. It also just has better base stats overall. So with the baseball bat being so easy to find early on, and so much better than the Nailboard, it's just kind of strange that the Nailboard exists, and you're probably just not going to take it on a melee build overall. For the pros of these weapons, and we're going to be kind of going over all the pros of these, they all have good VATS attacks. That's actually something that is really good. Grand Slam is fantastic, so that's really good for the Nailboard. And at least the two sledgehammers that we're going to talk about have pretty good item health. The Nailboard, not so much. For the cons of these, at least for the Nailboard, it does have low item HP. I know that's kind of weird to have good item HP, but that's for the sledgehammers. Bad item HP for the Nailboard. It also has somewhat low damage and low damage per second. Not so much with the sledgehammers, they're better than this, but the Nailboard and not as much. So now with that out of the way, there are actually quite a few perks that can help these two. Just the basic perks that kind of help out with all melee and unarmed weapons. So Slayer for faster attacks, Super Slam to knock enemies down, Piercing Strike to punch through armor, and Purifier to kill certain types of enemies. Those can all be really, really good, and that's no different for the Nailboard or any of these weapons. So if you're running a melee build, you might as well run all of those perks. They're all really good. For an overall rating for the Nailboard, I think I would actually put this thing into D tier. It's not the worst weapon in the game, but it's definitely a lacking weapon, and if people wanted to say that it's F tier, that's perfectly fine too. I wouldn't really argue with that because they are so rare to find, and there's just really no reason to use them. There's just so many better melee and unarmed weapons. It's not hard to find a baseball bat that just has better stats than this. You can even get a Gunrunner's Arsenal baseball bat and mod it out, and fills the same role as it, just much better. You could also go with other two-handed melee weapons like Super Sledge, Chainsaw, Thermic Lance. Those would all be better options. You're probably not going to be seeking out Nailboards as one of your go-to weapons overall. Let's move on to the Rebar Club and its unique version. So Rebar Clubs you're probably going to find once you start getting over the Repcon building, because the Nightkins can have them on their bodies, as well as the Nightkins in there will try to use them on you if they spot you. So the Rebar Club is basically like an in-between of the Sledgehammer and the Super Sledge. The Rebar Club requires 50 melee and 9 strength to wield. It requires a lot of strength overall, one of the highest of any of the weapons. This one does 42 damage on hit, which is okay. This one does 53 damage per second. It doesn't swing super fast like you would kind of expect for the Sledgehammers. They just generally don't swing very quick. This one does 24 damage on crit, which is half as much as its regular damage. A little bit strange, especially for a weapon like this, but some of the other hammers, like Super Sledges, are like this too. This one only has a 0.5 times crit chance, so fairly low. I don't know why that's actually as low as it is. This one costs 40 action points, so it's just not really that great to be using in VATS. Weighs 9 and has 250 item health, so it's kind of heavy for a melee weapon. It does have a lot of item health though. It doesn't break super fast as you would kind of expect from a weapon like this. This one doesn't have the Grand Slam VATS attack, so this one actually has the Mauler VATS attack, which is also really good. That can knock enemies down, and that's also just one of the best VATS attacks in the game. This one I actually find to be decent when you pick it up, especially if it's outside the Repcon building and you're going with a somewhat mixed build, or you're going with a melee and unarmed build. Assuming that you just didn't grab like Chance's knife and you can use that the whole game, or you didn't buy a baseball bat and you can use that basically the whole game. This one's a decent option. Even if you do have those weapons and you just don't want to break them, you can find plenty of Rebar Clubs around the Repcon building and just beat the ghouls and the Nightkins to death with it, so it actually makes for a decent weapon to be using, at least in that instance. And if nothing else, then you can at least sell those for a couple hundred caps each. They're not actually that bad for selling. For an overall rating for the Rebar Club, I'd say this thing's like C tier. It's okay overall, but nothing way spectacular, and there are better melee weapons than it. And then we go over to the unique version, which is called the Nuka Breaker. The Nuka Breaker you can buy once you get to New Vegas. You can buy this from Mick and Ralph, I believe. Unless Mick and Ralph are dead, and then you can buy it from the Gunrunners. Just like all the unique weapons, since once those NPCs die, they just all go to the Gunrunners since you can't kill that one. So the Nuka Breaker definitely looks different than a Rebar Club. It actually doesn't look anything like it. It is like a neon sign that you pick up and beat stuff with. This one requires 50 melee and 9 strength, same as the regular Rebar Club. This one does 50 damage per hit, so that's pretty good. 72 damage per second. This one does 72 damage per second, which is pretty nice. 50 damage on crit, so that's actually quite a bit better than the regular Rebar Club. It has the same damage as its regular damage. This has a 2 times crit modifier, so it's more likely to hit crits than other weapons, which is also really good. This one only costs 35 action points compared to the 40 that the Rebar Club has. Still not great, but it costs less, so that's kind of cool. This one weighs 8, one less than a Rebar Club, and this one has 200 item health as opposed to the 250 that the Rebar Club has, so it breaks a little bit quicker. Aside from that, this one also has a unique VATS attack on it as well. It doesn't have Mauler, this one has Nuka Break, and Nuka Break is specific to the Nuka Breaker, where you just swing this at an enemy and it does less damage than a regular hit in VATS. I don't know why that is. And it's not even like it costs less action points. So you're just nerfing your damage if you're going to be using Nuka Break in VATS. I don't think that this was coded correctly. I'm assuming it should have done more damage or had a unique status effect on top of it or something. Because I don't know why you'd have a VATS attack that's unique to this weapon, similar to like how the Katana has it, or I guess even to the Nailboard and the baseball bat, which are fairly unique with Grand Slam, where those attacks all do extra damage. In the case of the Katana and the baseball bat, a lot more extra damage. In this case, less damage. For reasons. So this one is better than a Rebar Club. I still wouldn't consider it one of the best melee weapons in the game. I think there are better two-handed melee weapons than this. I think the Fire Axes are better, I think the Proton Axes are better, and I think the Super Sledges are better. But this one is still pretty decent. So I'm going to put this one high up into B tier, bordering on A tier. I think it's okay overall, but definitely not one of my go-tos for melee weapons. So would I recommend any of these weapons? Maybe the Rebar Clubs are definitely worth getting. Nailboard's not so much. Nuka Breaker, maybe, especially if you like the aesthetics of it. It does look cool, and it's a very unique looking item. I like that you can just beat stuff with a Nuka-Cola sign, so that's pretty awesome. Today we're going to be taking a look at the 9-iron and its unique variant. This is one of the early game melee weapons that you can find. There is one actually very close to Good Springs, hidden in a shack. There's a couple of these you can find in like the town of Nipton as well. So you can get a couple of these pretty early on. They don't seem to be sold by vendors very often. At least I've never really paid that much attention to 9-irons being sold. And they're not always the most common item for enemies to be carrying. Really about the only enemies that do carry around 9-irons are like the Fiends, which they carry around a variety of melee weapons. So this could be an option if you want to run somewhat to New Vegas right away and kill some Fiends and get this. Let's go over the stats of the 9-iron. So for the regular 9-iron, which I'm pretty sure the 9-iron in the game isn't even a 9-iron. I'm pretty sure it's a putter. I could be wrong about that though. I don't play golf, so it could be very mistaken there. Tell me if I am down in the comments below. The 9-iron requires 25 melee weapons and 2 strength to wield, making it so that most characters are going to be able to wield this very easily, especially melee characters. So if you want to take this early on, you absolutely can. This does 17 damage per hit, which is fairly low for a melee weapon, especially a two-handed melee weapon, but that's okay. Does 38 damage per second, also kind of low. Not really the highest there either. Does 17 crit damage, which is the same as its regular damage. Has a 1x crit modifier, so nothing crazy there. Costs 22 action points to be using in VATS, which is fine. That's also not really that special. It's not really low either. The 9-iron as well as its unique variant do both have a unique move though for the VATS attack, where every melee weapon does, but this one is specifically unique, called 4. So this one costs quite a bit more action points and does less damage per hit, but it does have guaranteed knockdowns on it. It's very similar to like Mauler, similar to what we talked about with the Fire Axes, which that's a really, really good attack. That's actually really nice to have, because if you knock an enemy down, that means they're probably not going to be able to fight back. And if it is a one-on-one fight, you can take out just about anything that way with melee. It's also what makes Super Slam so strong with melee too, as well as it does give you some crowd control. This one will give you less since it is tied to the VATS attack, but it will still give you some. The 9-iron weighs 3 weight, and the 9-iron only has 60 item HP. The 9-iron can break really fast, and that's one of its major cons. Let's talk about the pros and cons of this. So the pros are that these are fairly common, at least it's easy to get them into the early game, so that's really cool. Another unique pro to this, besides its VATS attack being unique, it does actually have an achievement tied to it, or at least a challenge tied to it, which is a nice Bioshock reference where you have to kill Mr. House with a 9-iron, whether it be the regular one or the unique one. You get the achievement, I think it's called a Slave Obeys, since it's part of the reference from Bioshock saying that a man chooses and a slave obeys. Very cool reference there. I really like that about it. For the major cons of the 9-iron though, is that this thing kind of has low stats all the way around. It's not really that crazy. It's okay, but nothing way great. And it also has very low item HP. These things break really fast, which is not really good for a melee weapon, especially in the early game if you want to be using it there. 9-irons can be a little bit difficult to come by. Once you have jury rigging, this isn't an issue because you can fix it with any two-handed melee weapon. But in the early game, just looking around for 9-irons isn't going to be the easiest thing in the world. So usually I don't end up going with the 9-iron. If I'm going to go with a two-handed melee weapon early, I'll probably go with something like the shovel, and then swap that out for something like a baseball bat as soon as I can buy one of those. And then I'll just go from there, assuming I'm not going to be rushing any of the unique variants of weapons either. 9-iron isn't really high up on my priority list. There are a couple of perks that help out with this, that help out with all melee weapons and make melee really strong. Super Slam's really good, since it makes so you can knock down enemies, and if you knock them down, you can beat them up really easy. Slayer's really good because it gives you increased attack speed, so that's nice on any melee weapon. Piercing Strike gives you armor breaking, really good. And Purifier makes it so that you can deal extra damage towards mutated enemies like Deathclaws, Super Mutants, Centaurs, I guess. A couple other ones too, so that one can be pretty nice. Aside from that, there's no other perk that really helps us besides Pack Rat. Pack Rat actually does affect the unique version of it because the unique version weighs less than 2 weight. The regular 9-iron weighs 3. So for an overall rating for the 9-iron, I would honestly just put this thing into like D tier. I just don't use it that much. I don't think it's a terrible melee weapon. You can still get some value out of it. And if you wanted to do a full playthrough of just the golf clubs, I don't think it would be that difficult. But the regular 9-iron I'm really not going for. The health is really low on it, the damage is okay. I'd rather just go with something like the shovel that you can get right in Good Springs and just use that. Or again, go out and buy like a baseball bat that's going to have way higher health and just better stats all the way around and can be modded. Let's talk about the unique version. This is Nephi's Golf Driver. This one does look a little bit different. You can see that the head on this one looks different than the regular 9-iron, and I think that this might be a 9-iron, or maybe this is a wedge or something. Again, don't play golf, so I don't really know what each of these things are. If you do know, tell me in the comments below. Maybe these are both 9-irons and I'm just oblivious to it. But Nephi's Golf Driver is held by Driver Nephi, who you will find associated with the Fiends, and he is in New Vegas, or at least around New Vegas. He is one of the Fiend leaders, and if you kill him, then you can take this off of his body. So you will need to do that, or I guess you could reverse pickpocket him and take it. There's no real reason to not kill him unless you're doing a pacifist run, though. So you might as well do that. He is one of the 3 Fiend leaders that you get in the 3-card bounty, and one of their severed heads that you can actually take. So try not to mess up his head too much. Go over the body shots, rip his chest apart, and then take his head off so that way you get the most amount of caps out of this. Nephi's Golf Driver also requires 25 melee weapons and 2 strength to wield, same as the regular 9-iron. This one does quite a bit more damage, doing 30 damage per hit, which is actually pretty decent. That's not too bad for a 2-handed melee weapon. This one does 68 damage per second, also not too bad, not one of the highest ones, especially once we just looked at the Fire Axe, where the Fire Axes are both much better than this, but still decent enough. Does 30 crit damage, which is okay. Has an above average crit modifier of 1.2 times, so not a massive amount of crit chance, but still better than normal. Costs 21 action points, so 1 less action point than the regular one. This one only weighs 1 weight, which is kind of cool, because that's why Pack Rat affects it, so it gets cut in half to just half of a weight, which is kind of funny, because you would think at like half a weight melee weapon you could sneak this into areas. You can't sneak, I don't think, any 2-handed melee weapon into any area, so the golf club isn't that either. And this one has even lower item HP than the 9-iron. This one only has 50 HP, so it breaks even faster, and that can be even more annoying. This one does have substantially better stats and feels much better than the regular 9-iron, but it's still just, it breaks so quick that it's just not super practical. Again, later on, it can be if you have jury rigging or if you have a bunch of weapon repair kits. Let's say you have jury rigging, then you can get pool cues and fix this up, or any 2-handed melee weapon and fix this up. And it doesn't weigh very much, so it's not a terrible thing to be carrying around. But at the same time, if you want a lightweight melee weapon, there are things like combat knives and Bowie knives that are just frankly better than this, so it's also just not a fantastic weapon. It's not terrible by any means though, and I actually enjoy using it. So Nephi's Golf Driver, I think I'd actually put up in a B tier. I think it's still okay, but if you want a 2-handed melee weapon, going with something like the Fire Axes, the Proton Axe, the Super Sledge, Chainsaw, and Thermic Lance would all be better options than Nephi's Golf Driver. Even something like the modded out baseball bat would be better because it doesn't break and has kind of better stats than this. So you do have better options than this, and if you want something lightweight, again, the knives, the war club, something like that is just going to be better for a one-handed weapon, and especially if you want something that you could sneak in. So it doesn't really fit too well, but it's not terrible either. Would I recommend the 9-iron and Nephi's Golf Driver? 9-iron, probably not so much. I don't think it's really that good. Even in the early game, you can find better stuff than this. Nephi's Golf Driver, if you like it, sure, it's decent enough, and if you want to carry it around. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Police Baton, a very early game weapon that is a little bit underwhelming. So the Police Baton is something that you can get likely from powder gangers very early on. You can buy this from a couple vendors. You can potentially find this on various raiders. It's not really a standard weapon to be finding, especially into the mid and late game for basically any part of the game. Maybe you can find a couple in the Sierra Madre, which kind of makes sense because the security would have them. But yeah, the Police Baton is in kind of an awkward spot. The Police Baton requires 0 melee and 1 strength to wield, meaning that any character at any level can use this effectively, which is kind of cool. You would kind of expect that for a weapon like this since you can get it so early on. This does 10 damage per hit, which is fairly low for a melee weapon. Has 28 damage per second, which is also fairly low, but okay. It has a decent attack speed overall. This has 10 crit damage to it, which is fine, same as its regular damage. It's not very high, but it's the same, so that's kind of nice. Has a 1x crit modifier, so normal crits. Costs 23 action points, which is okay. That's kind of low, but there's other melee weapons that are lower than this that you can get earlier on, so it makes it really awkward in that regard too. This one weighs 2 weight, meaning that Pack Rat could cut it in half to 1 weight, and it's not super heavy to be carrying these around. This has a lot of item HP though. This has 250 item HP, so it doesn't break very quick, which you would kind of expect from something like this. A blunt weapon shouldn't break super fast, although the lead pipes do. I think the lead pipes would be a better option than this though, because they have higher damage. But yeah, 250 item health is pretty good. Makes it so if you are going to use this, you don't have to repair it. And then this, just like every melee weapon, has its own unique VATS attack. This one is Lights Out. We've talked about this before, where this is just the big overhead swing that you get with it. It does a little bit more damage for costing a little bit more action points. It's nothing way crazy for the police baton, but it is something, so that's kind of nice. Melee weapons are generally pretty decent in VATS, so that is a pro to this. For the pros of this weapon, it does have good item HP. That's really cool. It's not going to break very fast, and it is an early game weapon. So if you want to use this, that's perfectly fine. There's not a whole lot of other early game melee weapons to start out with, unless you want to rush Chance's knife, but then that kind of destroys like 90% of the melee weapons anyway. So like this is a decent option. You could argue that this being better or worse than like the straight razor or the knife. You could argue it being better or worse than some of the other weapons, maybe even the lead pipe early on, because even though you might get those early on and they do better damage, they do break a bit quicker. So the police baton still kind of has a use there in the very early game. The cons of this, though, is that it does low damage, it does low damage per second, and it falls off really hard later on. There's no real reason for you to be using a police baton later on into the game unless you're specifically doing a challenge run or you're doing a character-specific run. Like you're trying to be security or trying to be a cop or something in the wasteland, in which case then, yeah, the police baton still kind of works for that, but if you're just wanting to kill stuff quickly, there's a lot more better one-handed melee weapons and two-handed melee weapons as the game goes on. There are plenty of perks that help out with this too, the standard melee perks that help out with everything. Slayer is really good because you get more attack speed, so that's really nice. Purifier is good if you want to kill any sort of mutated creatures, deathclaws and stuff like that. I don't think you should be fighting them with the police baton, but you could, because melee can bully just about anything. Piercing Strike is good because you can punch through armor with it, so that's kind of nice. And then you also have Super Slam that can knock down enemies, and that allows you to 1v1 a lot of enemies with basically anything in melee. And these are all the perks that are really going to carry something like the police baton. The police baton doesn't really have much to add to these, and again, other melee one-handed weapons or two-handed weapons are going to be much better than this. So for an overall rating of my tier list, I would have to put the police baton into the F tier. It's not completely useless. It's not as bad as like the rolling pin that we also looked at not too long ago. This does have better stats than something like that, just across the board. The police baton is just one of those weapons where it doesn't really fill much of a niche. It kind of does in the very early game, so I could see people arguing this to D tier, because at least it has high item HP, and there's not a whole lot of other melee weapons early on that kind of have that. But then again, you could get like the shovel early on, or again, you could get Chance's knife early on if you want to go that route. You could get brass knuckles, which is all kind of going to be better than the police baton in particular. So I feel like that's where it kind of belongs. It's just kind of a weapon that doesn't really fill much of any sort of niche at any point in the game, unless again you're doing a character-specific run. Today we're going to be talking about the tire iron, because this one has been requested a decent amount for some odd reason. I think it's more of just a joke, because the tire iron is not particularly a crazy weapon in any way in Fallout. It really has never been. I think it's only been in Fallout New Vegas and Fallout 3. I don't remember it being in Fallout 4. I could be wrong about it being in earlier games too. So let's talk about the tire iron, a tool that's been turned into a makeshift bludgeon. And this is probably going to be one of the very first blunt weapons that you get access to early on. However, it's definitely not one of the strongest, nor is it potentially the first melee weapon that you can find, especially if you have some of the DLCs where you can start out with like the broad machete and have an advantage there. So the tire iron can be found all throughout the wasteland. It's pretty common for low-level enemies, at least human enemies, to potentially have tire irons. You can find these in a couple of places. Vendors tend to sell them pretty often too. You can buy them from like Chet, you can buy them from the Mojave outpost down south. I'm pretty sure you can buy them in Prim as well. So there's at least a decent amount of places that you can buy tire irons, and none of them are really going to be all that expensive. For the base stats of the tire iron, this requires 0 melee to wield effectively and only 3 strength. Again, if you're going with a strength build, you're probably going to have plenty of strength, so that's not a huge deal. You'll hit these no problem, which is pretty good because you can find these on powder gainers really early on and the escaped convicts really early on. So if you wish to take a tire iron, you absolutely can. This does 15 damage a hit, which is kind of low. It's not on the higher side, but it's okay for the early game. This does 35 damage per second, which is actually pretty decent. The tire iron does attack at least relatively fast. This does 15 crit damage, which again isn't really that high, but it's about on par with most other weapons where they do the same crit damage as their regular damage, just added on. This has a 1x crit modifier, so average crit chance. This costs 27 action points to use in VATS, which is kind of on the higher side, at least compared to some of the early melee weapons that we've already talked about, namely the machete in this case, where you kind of have a better option just in like the broad machete overall for action point cost. There's a couple other weapons that you can use for fairly low cost points too. This does have the unique VATS attack Lights Out. Any of the VATS attacks with melee you unlock once you hit 50 melee in total. Lights Out makes so you do a little bit more damage, but it costs you a little bit more action points. So it's a slightly stronger attack that you might be able to squeeze out if you're nearly out of action points and you got just enough to do it. Your person will also charge forward and then swing the tire iron down on top of an enemy's head, which, I mean, kind of looks interesting in VATS, although it does make it so enemies can attack you pretty often in VATS because you don't do this action particularly fast. This is also your power attack, and it's a power attack of a couple other weapons similar to this, like I believe it's the same as the lead pipe, it's the same as the war club. This one weighs 3 weight, so it's fairly lightweight, and this one has 200 item HP, so it actually has a lot of health, especially in the early game. That's the same as brass knuckles, I believe, that we talked about a couple videos ago. So it's not going to break very fast, which is pretty cool, and it's really not going to be hard to find tire irons to fix your tire iron up with. It's going to be even easier once you have something like jury rigging where you can fix it with any one-handed melee, but that's just a really nice advantage of melee in New Vegas anyway. For the pros of this weapon, there's actually not very many. It has high item HP for the start, so it's not going to break really quick, and it is an early game melee weapon, which is good. It is also, I guess, technically a melee weapon, so it has a lot of really good perks that go to it. There isn't any perk specifically that goes to the tire iron, but just generally good melee perks like Slayer, Super Slam, Piercing Strike are all going to make this even better than it already is, as well as you could build more action points because melee is quite good in a VATS build, even if the special attack from this isn't really anything too crazy, it's just kind of nice extra damage. So it does kind of have that going for it. For the general cons though, it's kind of everything else. This has low stats across the board. It's not really that high. Even for the early game, you can grab something like the shovel in Good Springs, and the shovel will outcompete the tire iron overall, since it has a higher crit chance, it has higher damage, it has a better VATS attack in it. So all of those, you might as well just do that if you want a blunt weapon, and it's a big two-handed weapon, so it's even got longer reach as well. Other weapons like the broad machete that I've been mentioning throughout this video would also be a better option most of the time than the tire iron, although the tire iron does have more health than it. But the broad machete will do more damage per second. Same thing goes with some of the other weapons like brass knuckles. If you're going with an unarmed mixed with a melee build, which you probably are, if you're going with one, you usually go with the other since they have so many perks that overlap with one another. All of those would kind of be better options than something like the tire iron. This does fall off pretty hard as well. It might be decent in the early game because you don't have to worry about the health, but as soon as you get something better than this, it's kind of just downhill from there, especially since you could just buy something like a baseball bat and mod it out, and that would also be a better option. And a lot of vendors sell them if you have the Gunrunner's Arsenal DLC, so that would be really nice. There's also no unique variant of the tire iron whatsoever either, which is interesting. At least in Fallout 3 there was, and in Fallout New Vegas there is no unique variant, it's just the regular tire iron, so you don't really have any upgrade path for this. So for an overall rating on my tier list, I would give the tire iron a D tier. It's not going to go to F tier because it's not a totally obsolete, useless weapon, because it is a melee weapon and it is kind of useful in the early game because of its item health, but it does fall off really hard. Basically nobody's going to be using this for the end game unless you're just carrying it around because you want to kill a specific named character with a tire iron. Fair enough. I mean, I get that. It's kind of the same thing with carrying around any weapon to kill named characters. Could be the same reason why you carry around a golf club to bash Mr. House's head in. I mean, that one does count for an achievement. Tire iron can also count for an achievement too. It counts for the one that's Thin White Line or something like that. It's the Mad Max reference, where if you're killing the various raiders with certain Mad Max style weapons, and the tire iron is one of those, Machete is also one of those that we talked about a couple videos ago, and then it also includes things like the sawed-off shotgun and a 44 Magnum. So there's plenty of options there, but it's pretty cool that it spans so many different weapon classes, so you can kind of kill them with whatever and still have something there, I think maybe besides energy weapons. But yeah, I think Tire Iron goes D tier. It's not really that good. It's not terrible. Again, it's melee, so it's pretty hard to make melee terrible. There are a couple that are terrible. So tell me your thoughts on the Tire Iron down in the comments below. How do you enjoy using it? Do you ever use it? I rarely use it at all. I mean, I used it for this video and I've used it for a couple other videos, but it's usually been for challenge things, not really for like a melee run. Today we're going to be talking about the rolling pin. The rolling pin is a surprisingly rare weapon to be finding in New Vegas, and it has no real reason as to why it is so rare. You just don't find these very often. Sometimes they can spawn with certain things, like if you take Wild Wasteland, you're guaranteed to get a couple of these if you go to Freeside, although you are going to be attacked by a group of women trying to rolling pin you to death. That isn't really that much of a threat though, especially compared to just other people trying to stab you in Freeside. So if you want the rolling pin, you can definitely get it that way. The rolling pin is a weapon that you may find early on because sometimes it can appear in boxes, and it's actually fairly common to find in like Old World Blues. Sometimes the lobotomites will have it at very low levels. You can also just find it around there in like different boxes around there. So if you want to run to Old World Blues, that might be a way to get it. The rolling pin requires 0 melee in order to use effectively, and only 2 strength. Although I don't know why it's 2 strength. You think it'd be 1 strength since this is supposed to be kind of like a beginning weapon too, but whatever, okay. This one does a massive 3 damage per hit, making it one of the weakest melee weapons, if not the weakest melee weapon in the entire game, and just one of the weakest weapons in general. This one does a massive 5 damage per second, so also extremely weak compared to basically everything in the game. This has 8 crit damage on it, so it actually surprisingly does over double its regular damage as crit damage, which could be impressive for certain weapons. It's just not for this weapon, but it's something. Even though this one technically has a 0 times crit chance. So you can still hit sneak crits with it to get more damage, but regular crits just won't appear. Although this might be another one that's not accurate from the wiki, because I swear I was hitting crits with this earlier when I was testing it. So it's probably 0 point something. I don't know exactly the amount, but 0 point something more than likely. This costs 24 action points to be using in VATS, which is okay for melee generally, but for a weapon like this, it's not that good. This one only weighs 1 weight, so that's kind of cool. Doesn't weigh very much. And this one has 100 item health, which I really wish it had more, because 100 item health is not always the most for a melee weapon. It would be fine for other melee weapons. Like, I think the fire axes have about 100 health, but the fire axes are usually like 2 or 3 shotting enemies. This, you're gonna have to like 30 shot an enemy to kill them. And just like all melee weapons, this one does have its own unique VATS attack in it, which I do wish that this one actually did have its own unique melee attack just for it, similar to how like the Katana has that. But this one's like a lot of the various blunt weapons, similar to like the lead pipe and stuff. This one is called Lights Out. Lights Out lets you just swing down the rolling pin on top of enemies' heads with 2 hands. It's a little bit slower to swing, but it does more damage slightly, and it costs a little bit more action points. It's honestly not that great overall for the rolling pin. For the general pros of the rolling pin, it kind of only has one pro going for it, and that is that it's a meme weapon that's kind of funny to use. It is silly to beat stuff with a rolling pin. The cons are basically everything else with the weapon. It's got low damage, it's got low DPS, it's got low health, so you can break it at least low health compared to how often you're going to have to hit something with it. It doesn't really have high crit chances. It doesn't make very good use of action points either, so it's not particularly great in a VATS build. It's outclassed by basically every other melee weapon, every one-handed and two-handed melee weapon. I guess another pro you could add to this one, though, is that it's technically a sneak-in weapon, so you could sneak this into like a casino, which still wouldn't be a good option, but it would be something that you could do if you really wanted to do it. I guess there's that going for it. There are some perks that can help out with this, but it's basically just all the other melee perks that let melee be really strong. And if you can make certain weapons, like, let's say a fire axe, overpowered or at least very strong with melee, you can't really do the same thing with the rolling pin, but it does at least swing things in your favor a little bit. So Super Slam is really good with this one because you can knock enemies down. And if you're fighting a one-on-one fight, you can win with a rolling pin, assuming that your rolling pin doesn't break before you kill the enemy. You could reasonably take out a Deathclaw with a rolling pin, again, so long as your rolling pin does not break when you're fighting it. Piercing Strike can be useful since it gives you armor piercing, and you're gonna want that with how low damage this thing has, so that armor isn't as big of a deal. Although, as soon as enemies start showing up in like medium and heavy armor, even Piercing Strike may not be enough to really help you out. VATS perks can sort of help since it's melee, and you might want to use this in VATS, because VATS gets you more damage with melee, but it's not that much more. So, it's your call if you want that or not. And then you could also even go with the trait Heavy-Handed, which makes it so you're even worse at crits, but since this thing has such bad crits, it might not matter. And you get more base damage, which is a slight bonus. Honestly, I don't know if this actually is a bonus. It might be better to not take this and just go with those crits that you might hit when you're sneaking. I guess if you're not sneaking, then maybe consider Heavy-Handed, but that would be the only way to do it. So, on my tier list for the rolling pin, this one's going to have to go to the F tier. It's one of the worst weapons in the entire game to be using for anything. You're probably not going to be using this unless you either find it silly or you're doing a challenge run. And that's going to be about it. Or I guess if you're using it as repair fodder for one of your better one-handed melee weapons. But even then, they're so rare that you might not even do that because you're not going to find them, and something like a lead pipe or a knife is way, way more common than a rolling pin is. So, would I recommend the rolling pin? No, not really, unless you're doing a challenge run. It's not a good weapon, like at all. It's not really good at anything. It can be kind of strong against lower leveled enemies and even some mid-game enemies, but that's more because melee has some of the strongest perks in the game and it just lets you bully stuff regardless. Either way, tell me your thoughts on the rolling pin down in the comments below. I'd love to hear them. Now for the melee weapon that everybody has been waiting for, the mighty pool cue. Maybe. Welcome back to the Wasteland, everybody. Welcome back to New Vegas, where today we're going to be taking a look at the pool cue and its unique variant, Old Glory. So these ones are very interesting weapons in that they are just leagues apart from one another, which is pretty funny. So the regular pool cue you can find all throughout New Vegas. This is an early game weapon. You can find a lot of them in the mid game. There are a couple enemies that carry around pool cues, mainly the fiends. They have a lot of them. Generally, if you're fighting a fiend that has a pool cue, they probably also have frag grenades that they're going to try to chuck at you first and then charge you with the pool cue. Which, I mean, I guess that's the best strategy you could hope for with a pool cue, but alright. So the regular pool cue is a very disappointing weapon. Let's go over the stats. For melee requirements, this requires 0 melee and 2 strength, so basically any character is going to be able to wield this, which is good. I would kind of hope most characters would be able to wield a pool cue. This one does a massive 15 damage on hit, which is very low. This one does 24 damage per second. It doesn't swing incredibly quick since it is a two-handed weapon, and those tend to swing a bit slower than one-handed melee weapons. This one does have 15 crit damage, so the same as its regular damage. However, at least on the wiki, it says this one has a 0 times crit modifier, which I don't think that's entirely accurate. I think this is another one where the wiki is incorrect, because I swear I've hit crits with this, but it is probably less than a 1 times crit modifier, which I don't know why that is. I don't think that this weapon benefits from not hitting crits. It doesn't benefit just from hitting things regularly, so hitting crits would only make it better. This one costs 27 action points to use in VATS, which is okay, and this one does actually have a good VATS attack in it, at least if it had higher stats, because it has Grand Slam, and Grand Slam is a fantastic VATS attack on something like the baseball bat, which you can get early on and can prove to be a very effective melee weapon. And would also just be a straight upgrade to this weapon, no matter when you got it or how you were going to use it. Grand Slam does do a lot of extra damage, which is pretty nice, and melee weapons in general do benefit heavily from VATS. This does only weigh 1 weight, which is cool, because that makes it so Pack Rat actually affects the pool cue to where it can be cut in half in weight. That's something. And this has a measly 50 item health. It has terrible item health overall, and that makes it so there's not a whole lot of uses to the pool cue since it gets outcompeted by almost every melee weapon in the game. There's a couple that you could argue that it's better than, like maybe something like the rolling pin, because it's a two-handed melee weapon, and it does have higher base damage, although you could say that one's just a gimmick weapon too, so I don't think that there's any two-handed weapon that's actually worse than the pool cue, honestly. For the pros of this weapon, it's easy to find, and there is another pro to the pool cue that's not necessarily a great pro to have, but it is a pro, and that is that it works really well as repair fodder for jury rigging. So if you have the perk Jury Rigging, this one is actually pretty decent to be picking up pool cues, and like I said, if you combine it with Pack Rat where they only weigh half a weight, you can carry around a lot of pool cues, which is good, but yeah, usually pool cues will just turn into repair fodder for any other two-handed melee weapon, and that's its like main That's the main pro going to the pool cue. It doesn't do a whole lot of damage. It doesn't do a whole lot of damage per second. Yes, it's a two-handed melee weapon, so perks can carry it, but that's just kind of perks carrying any weapon. For the cons of this, the major con is that it just has bad stats all the way around. Like I said, not really high damage, not really high damage per second. Crit chance is fairly low. Action point cost isn't terrible, but it's not great. Weight is low, which is good. Item health is terrible. It just has a lot of things going bad for it, and its best use is going to be repair fodder. There are some perks that help out with this though. Like I said, jury rigging and pack rat are actually a decent combination for this weapon. Slayer makes it so you can attack faster, which is always good. Super slam makes it so you can knock down enemies on the ground, which if it's a two-handed weapon like the pool cue, it actually has a higher chance of doing that, and the pool cue at least swings decently quick. It won't kill things very quickly once you knock them on the ground, but you can knock them on the ground. Purifier to kill things like mutants and deathclaws and stuff. You probably shouldn't be fighting deathclaws with a pool cue, but I can admire it. Your pool cue might legitimately break before you kill a deathclaw with it. It has that low of item health. And piercing strike is also good because you can punch through extra armor. For an overall rating for the pool cue, this one's going to have to go into F tier. I think it is the worst two-handed melee weapon in the game. You can get the shovel right away at the very start of the game, and the shovel is much better with a higher crit chance, actually pretty decent damage and decent damage per second, and having the extra utility that you can dig up graves and stuff. So I would say that that one's a bit better, and there's no real reason for you to not use that, as well as you could find things like sledgehammers or rebar clubs somewhat early on into the game. You can buy baseball bats from vendors, and you can find baseball bats early on. If you buy a Gunner's Arsenal baseball bat, that's going to be just 100 times better than the pool cue is overall. So there is just way better options. Now let's move to the unique version of the pool cue, which is on the whole other side of the spectrum. This one is called Old Glory. This is Ulysses' melee weapon, which is a unique one. This one, it's kind of weird that this one's considered a pool cue because it's more of a flagpole that Ulysses is using, but I guess it's close enough. Old Glory requires 50 melee and 7 strength in order to wield, so a lot of strength. Not too much melee though. This one does 45 damage per hit, which is pretty good. Does 85 damage per second. This one does attack fairly fast. Has 80 crit damage. It actually has a lot of crit damage. That's more than a brush gun hit with a crit, so that's really good. This one has a 1.5 times crit modifier, so it's more likely to hit crits. Only costs 22 action points to use in VATS, so it's actually really good as a VATS weapon. It has the same VATS attack as the pool cue and Grand Slam, where you do more damage. And for a weapon that has pretty high damage, that's just a huge bonus for it. This one does weigh a lot more than the pool cue at 8, so you can't cut it in half with pack rat, and it's not heavy enough to be cut down with heavyweight, but 8 weight isn't anything crazy. Especially since it's a melee weapon, you don't need to be carrying around multiple versions of it. If you want to, you can just carry around pool cues. You don't even need jury rigging to fix it up with this. And this one has 250 item health, which is way better than the 50 item health that the pool cue has. Old Glory is legitimately one of the best two-handed melee weapons in the game, and I'd put this one all the way up into S tier. I think it's much, much better than the pool cue is. There is kind of the downside of this weapon, though, is that it is Ulysses' weapon, so you're going to have to get all the way to the end of the Lonesome Road, which is generally like the last DLC in the game, or kind of the conclusion to the DLCs in the game, depending on which order you do them in. So you will have to go all the way to the end of the Divide in order to actually get this weapon. But at least you can use this weapon, unlike something like the Blade of the East, where you don't really get a chance to do that unless you spawn it in. Old Glory, fantastic melee weapon. Pool cue, really terrible melee weapon. Would I recommend the pool cue? Absolutely not. Would I recommend Old Glory? Yes. It's very good. Today we're going to be taking a look at some interesting melee weapons. We're going to be taking a look at the Cattle Prod and the Dress Cane. Why I'm grouping both these two together, it's mostly because they'd be awkward to talk about individually and they're not like other weapons, so I figured I would include them both in this list, even though they don't really have very much in common, so this one's going to be a little bit of a weird one. The Cattle Prod is actually like a mid to late game melee weapon that you can see like the MPs of the NCR carrying around. These are fairly rare. You're probably going to have to take one from them or steal one of these. Most shops don't really sell them, although I'm not really on the lookout for them, so maybe shops sell them more often than what I think. The Cattle Prod requires 75 melee to use and 4 strength, which is kind of weird to have it have that much melee requirement when it's not really a regular melee weapon. This is supposed to be like a non-lethal melee weapon. This one does 5 damage on hit, which is extremely low, 12 damage per second, which is also very low. Has a big old 5 crit damage on it, so also low. Has a 2x crit chance though, so you're more likely to hit crits than normal, which I guess is okay. This one costs 28 action points to use in VATS, so it's fairly high VATS cost, at least for a weapon that doesn't really do that much damage. This weighs 3 weight, so it's not even affected by Pack Rat. This has a whopping 500 item HP though, so cattle prods do not break fast. You can use one of these for basically forever. And the unique effect that this has is that it inflicts 50 fatigue damage on hit. Now fatigue damage is kind of bugged in New Vegas, at least by default. You can have mods that fix it. But fatigue damage is supposed to build up until you knock an enemy out. But this is based off of your overall damage from the weapon. And that makes it so you're actually building up fatigue slower than you would otherwise be with the cattle prod. Again, this is supposed to be like a non-lethal weapon. You hit somebody so much or hit an enemy so much that they just collapse from the fatigue damage. Kind of a cool idea, but it just doesn't really matter in this game, especially when you have other abilities that kind of do this better or other things that can inflict fatigue damage better. Beanbags with the riot shotgun is probably the best way to inflict fatigue damage, and even that isn't really that good. If you actually want to do this in a practical way, probably take something like Paralyzing Palm and just smack stuff with unarmed. That's going to work out a whole lot better for you and probably be a better weapon overall. And you could also take Super Slam, which knocks down enemies too. So if you just want to knock an enemy down so that they can't fight back and then beat up on them, any melee weapon can do that with that particular perk. Let's go over the pros and cons of these weapons, which are going to be a little bit strange because it's almost split in half as to what they're good for. The cattle prod is good for non-lethal damage, which is kind of useful, and it has really high item HP, and those are kind of its only 2 pros that it has going for it. The cons are that it's just not very strong, it doesn't have very high damage, it doesn't have very good DPS, it's just not really that great unless you're doing like a challenge run for a melee build or a pacifist build and you want to have a weapon. Let's talk about the dress cane next, and then we'll go over the pros and cons to that, because otherwise this might be a little bit strange. So the dress cane you can find usually in the Ultralux. I think that's actually the only place that you can get a dress cane, so you will probably have to kill some people in the Ultralux, which isn't very difficult. Even if you're doing their mainline quest, you're going to find a couple dress canes. This one requires 50 melee weapons and 2 strength to wield, so it is fairly low in both those requirements. This one and the cattle prod also count as holdout weapons, or at least improved holdout weapons, so you can sneak them into casinos and other areas, which is kind of useful, I guess. The dress cane does 22 damage per hit, which is actually pretty decent. 51 damage per second, which is also decent. This one has 35 crit damage, so it actually has more crit damage than its regular damage, interestingly enough. A 1x crit modifier, which is okay. Costs 27 action points, which is okay as well. Not the best, but alright. Weighs 3 weight as well, and this one only has 50 item HP. The dress canes do break quite a bit faster than something like a cattle prod, 10 times faster even. These also have the same VATS attack. They have the lights out, which is similar to a lot of the blunt one-handed weapons, which is just you run forward and smack something. Does extra damage, but it costs extra action points, so it's fine as a VATS attack, but nothing way crazy. No special effect on top of this. For the pros and cons of the dress cane, the pros are that it has actually pretty decent damage per second, and you can sneak this in, which is kind of cool. The major cons, though, for this one is that it just has very low item HP, and it's going to fall off compared to other melee weapons, even sneak-in melee weapons. Something like the War Club, if you want a blunt one-handed weapon, would be better than this, or even the lead pipe, like the unique one, would be also better than this. Things like the Bowie Knife and Chance's Knife would also be good if you just want to sneak them in. All of those are better than something like the dress cane. There are perks that help out these weapons. Super Slam that we talked about, so you can knock enemies down. Kind of defeats the purpose of the cattle prod, but I mean, you could use it with the cattle prod. Purifier to do extra damage towards certain enemies, Slayer to just attack faster, and Piercing Strike so that you can punch through armor. Those are all pretty useful. They're all great for melee and unarmed in general. For an overall rating for the cattle prod, this one's going to go right into F tier. I think it's one of the worst weapons in the game. It's a non-lethal weapon that's not very good at its job. Most of the time, unless you're doing a pacifist run, you don't really care if you're going to be lethal anyway, and the best non-lethal run is just going to be a high speech and a high barter, as well as high charisma character anyway, so you might as well just pump those stats and not even worry about a weapon, unless you're specifically doing a challenge run to just use the cattle prod, or to use non-lethal weapons like this, and I guess beanbags and maybe some other weapons. Again, Paralyzing Palm would probably be a better option than this. And then for the dress cane, I'm going to put this one into low C tier. I think it's fine. It's an okay enough melee weapon that you're just going to be getting too late into the game to really matter. If you want to use it, cool. I do like it. I think it's funny to give this in the tuxedo to Veronica and just watch her beat up people with the cane. I find that kind of hilarious. But outside of that, it's not really like a melee weapon or an unarmed weapon that I'm just going to go for out of the blue. Tell me your thoughts on the cattle prod and the dress cane down in the comments below. I'd love to hear them. Do you guys like these weapons? I mean, I kind of like the Dress King because it looks cool, but I don't really use the cattle prod. Today we're going to be taking a look at the lead pipe as a weapon. And the lead pipe is probably one of the most simplistic weapons in the game, and it's also a very common weapon that you can find pretty early on. Like, basically every type of enemy can have these, as well as you can find them just randomly around the wasteland. Sometimes they'll appear in boxes. A lot of the time they can appear in the fire hose areas. So if you see like a fire hose on a wall, loot it, and there might be a lead pipe or a tire iron in it. Lead pipes are the better option than tire iron. This one's actually a pretty decent early game melee weapon. So the lead pipe requires 50 melee, which is kind of surprising with how early you can get this. And it requires 5 strength to wield. Strength shouldn't be an issue. If you're going to the melee build, you're probably going to have high strength. And if you're not, you're just planning on using this as your melee weapon in like a guns build, that's perfectly fine too. Most guns builds are going to be running like 5 strength as well. The lead pipe does 22 damage per hit, which is actually pretty decent. That's actually pretty good damage for the early game, and it's got pretty good damage per second at 56, so it attacks fairly fast. It is still a one-handed weapon, so it doesn't have the longest range, but that's okay. It still has decent enough range. This one does 22 crit damage, same as its normal damage, and has a 1x crit modifier. Pretty normal crit modifier there. Most weapons have this. This only costs 24 action points to use in VATS, making it a pretty decent weapon to use in VATS, honestly. As well as every melee weapon does have its own unique VATS attack. For the lead pipe and the unique version of the lead pipe, it's both the same. It's called Lights Out. Lights Out is a very straightforward attack where your person just runs forward and swings down the pipe on top of somebody's head, usually, or on their shoulder or whatever it might be. This deals a little bit extra damage, but it costs a little bit more action points. So it's okay compared to regular VATS attacks with this, but it's nothing way crazy with it. It does make it so you can leap forward a little bit faster, and you can actually make surprisingly decent distance with this. It's not as good as like the War Club if you want to actually be using this as like a leapfrog weapon to actually get more movement speed. It seems to be about the same as if you were just taking like maybe travel light and then running in a straight line. So it's a little bit faster than normally walking, I think, but not that much faster if you want to use it as that. This weighs 3 weight, which isn't very much, although this doesn't have very much item health. This only has 50 item health, and early on you probably won't have jury rigging, but there is a lot of lead pipes laying around, so fixing it up shouldn't be too bad, but it can be a little bit heavy if each one is weighing you down by 3. With 50 HP, this one does break really fast, which is kind of unfortunate for the lead pipe. For the general pros of the lead pipe, this one has pretty good damage and pretty good damage per second for an early game weapon. And it's also a sneak-in weapon, so that's kind of cool. You can sneak in lead pipes or the unique version of it into any sort of holdout area. And most of the time, melee weapons are pretty good in those type of areas. The lead pipe is no real exception to that. Major con to this, though, is that it does have very low item health. And that's really its only major con, because these are pretty easy to find. They're pretty early on, and if you can find a lot of them, then you don't have to worry about the health. But these things do break really fast, especially compared to certain melee weapons, which I find a little bit strange, because you wouldn't think a pipe would break very quick at all, but I guess it depends on how thick the pipe actually is. Let's talk about some perks too that can help out with the lead pipe and just melee in general. We have quite a few of them, and they're the same ones that we usually go over. So Slayer is really nice because it gets you increased attack speed, so that one's fantastic for any melee weapon or unarmed weapon. Piercing Strike makes it so that all of your melee and unarmed have armor breaking on them, also really good. You have Super Slam, which can knock down enemies, and if you knock down an enemy, it's going to be really easy to beat them up. Since the lead pipe attacks fairly fast, this does help it. This helps more with faster attacking weapons, although Super Slam does make it so you have an increased chance to knock down enemies if you're using a two-hand weapon as opposed to a one-handed weapon. The lead pipe is a one-handed weapon, but that's okay. And then you can also stack Purifier on this to get extra damage towards the various abominations of the wasteland, which does help, although you're probably not going to be considering the lead pipe for like a late game weapon most of the time. It's mostly going to be good in the early and mid game, and then you're probably going to swap this off for something else as your go-to melee weapon. Either a unique version of something, or one of the stronger overall melee weapons like the War Club or the Katana or something like that. For an overall rating for the lead pipe, I'd probably put this thing into C tier, although it is very high C tier, because in the early game it is really good, and if you can find a couple of these, it does make the early game a lot easier for a melee build. But there is still some other good weapons that you can find early on, and as well as if you want to run and get some of them, it's not too difficult. Like Chance's Knife completely beats this, and like 90% of the other melee weapons. We kind of have to talk about that every time we talk about melee weapons, but assuming you're not doing that and you're just picking up stuff randomly, the lead pipe could actually be a pretty decent option, because it's better than quite a few of the other early game melee weapons that you get access to. It's better than like the kitchen knives, it's better than the police batons, the tire irons, I guess potentially the rolling pin. It's better than actually quite a lot of those. Maybe not better than the shovel that you can pick up in Good Springs, and maybe not better than like a baseball bat, which you could also get to this point, but it's still one of the better melee weapons overall. There is a unique version of the lead pipe as well, so we need to talk about that, and that is called the Humble Cudgel. This one you can find in the sewers of New Vegas. So you have to go up into the sewers of New Vegas. It is found on a dead prospector or a dead member. I think they're actually named. You find somebody dead in the sewer and you can loot this off of their body. This one does look quite a bit different than a regular lead pipe because it's no longer just the straight lead pipe with the connector as the head of it. It's now like kind of a bent, more steel looking lead pipe, and it has like a T-joint attached to it, so you can kind of use that as like a hammer. It's kind of cool. You're gonna have to fight through some enemies to get to this, I believe, because usually the sewers have ghouls and rats. I don't think there's a whole lot of enemies near the actual body, so it's usually not hard to get to, but it is kind of out of the way to actually get this weapon. And this weapon's actually pretty decent. This one also requires 50 melee and 5 strength, just like the regular lead pipe. This one does a little bit more damage at 26 damage per hit, which is pretty good. Has quite a bit more DPS at 72. That is actually really nice. 26 crit damage, a 1x crit modifier, only costs 21 action points, funny enough, so this one's actually even better in a VATS build, and it's not bad overall. This one weighs 3, same as the normal pipe, and this one does have more item health at 75, so it's still going to break kind of fast, but it's not going to break as fast as regular lead pipes. This one's quite a bit better. It's almost on par with something like the War Club. It's just the War Club gets upgrades, which make it quite a bit better, mostly the attack speed upgrade that it gets, as well as it gets increased damage, so it's not quite on that level, but it is about on par with a standard non-upgraded War Club, so that's pretty good, but I don't think I could give this thing any higher than like a B tier. I don't think it's as good as some other melee weapons, especially ones that we've talked about, like the Katana that we recently went over. The Katana is a lot better than the Humble Cudgel, but yeah, the Katana does have upgrades, and it's probably just a stronger base weapon overall. This one's still not bad, and it still is a sneak-in weapon, so if you want to grab something just to take into casinos, it is kind of fun to wander around and just beat people with a lead pipe, I would say. But that's about it. It's going to still get outcompeted by other melee weapons in the late game, even like sneak-in weapons, because again, you could sneak in like Chance's Knife, Blood Nap, a couple of other like unarmed weapons like Love and Hate. That would probably be better than this one too. But it's still a pretty decent weapon. If you want to use it, you can absolutely use it for the entire game. It's not going to be one of your strongest options. So should you use the lead pipe? Maybe. In the early game, they're decent. Later on, probably not. Just because you're probably going to find better melee weapons. And if you're going with a dedicated melee weapons build, you're definitely going to be able to get better weapons and probably have them on you. But it's by no means a terrible weapon. It's like right in the middle of melee weapons. Today we're going to be taking a look at a very special weapon of the Mojave. This is the good old baseball bat. Now there's actually technically 2 versions of the baseball bat in New Vegas. There is the standard version that you can find in the regular game, and then there's also one that is added with the Gunrunner's Arsenal DLC, which you can only purchase. However, these are statistically the same as one another, so they will be sharing the same stats, but the Gunrunner's Arsenal version can be modded, which is pretty awesome. The baseball bat requires 25 melee weapons and only 4 strength, so it is a pretty lightweight weapon, especially for a melee build. You can use this basically right at the start, which is fantastic because you can find these right at the start. Sometimes powder gangers will have them. Sometimes other raiders might have them, and even just regular baseball bats aren't super hard to find. Gunrunner's Arsenal bats are even easier to find because almost every traveling merchant will be selling one of these, and they're also very cheap. They're going to cost you like 300, 400, 500 caps at most, depending on how high or low your barter skill is. So it's going to be a super cheap weapon that you can buy early on. This does 22 damage per hit, which is pretty decent for an early game melee weapon. That's not super high, but it's not super low either. This does 36 damage per second, which is fine. It swings fairly fast. This has 22 crit damage on it, which is also normal. This has a 1x crit modifier, pretty normal there. This only costs 25 action points using VATS, which isn't super high. It's not super low for a melee weapon though either, so it's kind of in the middle. This only weighs 3 weight, which is great. Doesn't weigh very much. And this thing has a whopping 400 item health to it, which is fantastic. That makes it so the baseball bat will take forever to break. This is probably one of the most durable melee weapons in the game, just kind of overall at everything, since it isn't like an automatic weapon. It's not something like the chainsaw or the thermic lance. This one you do just have to beat stuff to death with if you wish to break the bat. This one does have a unique VATS attack as well. Basically every melee weapon does, but this one is especially unique. The unique attack for this is called Grand Slam. Grand Slam takes more action points than it otherwise would, but it does a lot more damage, and it doesn't take that much more action points. It's only 10 more, so you go from 25 to 35, and it deals double damage which is fantastic. It also has a very high chance of knocking enemies down if you don't kill them outright with Grand Slam. So this has one of the best VATS attacks out of any of the melee weapons, which is awesome. It's really cool that it has that unique attack. For the general pros of the baseball bat, this one has really high item health. It takes forever to break the bat, which is just fantastic. You don't have to worry about it just getting destroyed super fast. Certain melee weapons in the game can break pretty quick. We already talked about that with like the machete having like 50 item health. This thing's going to take 8 times as long to break as something like a machete normally, so you don't have to worry about fixing this up, and baseball bats aren't super hard to get. They're pretty easy to fix up, even more so if you have jury rigging where you can fix it with any two-handed weapon. So if you find pool cues, which are really abundant throughout the wasteland, you can fix it up right away, and there you go, you got your bat all set. This thing has pretty good stats across the board too. That's another good pro. Nothing way crazy, but well, besides the item health, but everything else is decent enough. And this thing is very, very common, which is fantastic, either to buy from people or just to find on the ground. If you're finding them on the ground, though, they are just going to be the standard baseball bats, and they're not going to be the Gunner's Arsenal bats. And I would say that it would be a better investment to actually grab one of those. For the cons of the baseball bat, the only real con to it is that it kind of falls off later. There's other melee weapons that kind of do this job better. Something like a super sledge will probably outcompete something like a baseball bat as you get going, unless you just don't really like the weight of that. There's a couple other melee weapons that are fairly similar to the baseball bat that are just kind of better than this, like Old Glory. So it can get outcompeted, but it's still a pretty solid weapon in the early to mid game. And I'd put the baseball bat, at least the regular one, up into B tier. I think it's perfectly fine for most jobs and actually does pretty well for a designated melee weapon. Now, let's talk about the Gunner's Arsenal version, because you can actually put 3 mods on this and mod it out even further, and that makes it quite a bit better. So the baseball bat has 3 mods. You can buy these from vendors. It's actually very, very common for traveling merchants to be selling parts of these, and again, selling the bat itself, so you can get this like right away. It really wouldn't be hard to get a fully modded out baseball bat just by the time that you're heading down to like the Mojave trade post down at the south part. You could find the traveling merchants around there and likely be able to purchase all the parts for this and make a fully functional baseball bat, which will get you a pretty big advantage in the early game. This one has the nails that you can put in it. Nails increase your damage by 6, so you go up from 22 base damage up to 28 base damage. That's pretty good. You can also have a cork core. This makes it so you have 20% faster attack speed, so your DPS gets upped quite a bit. That's pretty cool. This also helps with any of the melee perks too. Things like Super Slam or Slayer get even stronger because of this, since you can just attack even quicker. And then the last one is a maple body that you can put on this, which increases its item health by 50%. So it goes from that whopping 400 item health that was really difficult to break up to 600 item health, so it's even more difficult to break. And that's the same item health as this machine, and this machine is one of the most durable rifles in the game. You're probably not going to even be using this as much as like this machine. Maybe you will against certain types of enemies, but it's going to take forever for you to break the baseball bat, so you really don't have to worry about getting it fixed anytime soon. Again, you're going to be able to find baseball bats, and if you have jury rigging, like pool cues are going to be super, super common, as well as some other potential weapons, maybe things like Rebar club or the Nailboards or something you could fix up with. And all of these things onto the baseball bat are really, really nice. They make a pretty decent weapon even better, to where it's actually a pretty good weapon all throughout the game if you'd like to use it. There's not really a downside to using this, and I would put this thing all the way up into A tier. It's a pretty solid weapon overall. I really enjoy it. Let's talk about some of the perks too that kind of help out with the baseball bat. There's no specific perk that actually helps with the baseball bat. I kind of wish something like Heave Ho did, or if Little Leaguer was still in the game like it was in Fallout 3. That would be kind of cool to have this just for like a bat specific or certain weapon specific, but there is no weapon specific thing that helps out with this, so general melee bonuses are going to be the best for this, and some of them are pretty strong with this. Slayer is particularly strong. Slayer just gets you more attack speed, so that's fantastic. Super Slam is fantastic because with two-handed weapons you're more likely to knock down enemies, and the baseball bat attacks pretty fast, especially if you have that cork core in it where it's attacking 20% faster. This is one of the quicker two-handed weapons that melee can use. I don't think it's the fastest, but it is fairly quick, so you can just kind of bully stuff thanks to that. You can also get Piercing Strike, where you just ignore armor. That's fantastic for any melee or unarmed build. And then you can also get Purifier, which will get you some more damage towards mutated enemies, so you can beat up on Deathclaws, mutants, ghouls a little bit easier. All of those help. And then of course you could stack chems on top of this too, like you take Rushing Water, and you can basically bully anything to death with the baseball bat, at least if it's a one-on-one fight. So that's pretty cool. Melee can kind of get away with that though. In New Vegas, melee is pretty strong. And the baseball bat is a pretty good all the way around weapon. It's a really nice melee weapon all throughout. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Super Sledge and the other sledgehammer too, because they're kind of together, sort of. Honestly, I didn't know if I wanted to include the sledgehammer with this video or if I wanted to include it with the Rebar Club and the Nuka Breaker, but I figured it fit more in line with the Super Sledge since it's more of a designated hammer or tool, whatever the heck you want to call it. So the base sledgehammer, you can actually get pretty early on into the game. Super Sledges are going to be much later into the game. Certain enemy types can carry these as well. Super Mutants can carry both sledgehammers in the early game, although they might also carry like Nailboards and Rebar Clubs instead of sledgehammers, but they can still carry them around. And then into the later levels, they can carry the Super Sledges around, as well as members of the Brotherhood can carry the Super Sledge. You can find Caesar's Legion that might be carrying a Super Sledge, as well as the White Legs in Zion and the Lobotomites and Old World Blues at higher levels can also carry around Super Sledges. I think the Lobotomites can also have regular sledgehammers, but I could be wrong about that. I'm not entirely sure. This requires 50 melee weapons and 7 strength to wield, so pretty okay melee weapons, very high strength to wield, but with a melee character, you're generally going with high melee anyway and high strength, so this shouldn't be that big of a deal for you to pick up and use. And with how rare these things pop up, you may not actually be getting one until like the mid game, where the sledgehammer honestly isn't really the greatest. If you can find one early on, it can be pretty decent, but later on it just sort of gets out competed by some of the other like two-handed melee weapons. The sledgehammer does 24 damage per hit, which is pretty decent, 46 damage per second. The sledgehammers don't really swing all that fast as you'd kind of expect them to, so the damage per second is fine for them, but it's not going to be as high as other weapons like a fire axe in terms of like DPS and swing speed. This one does 24 crit damage, which is okay. It's the same as its regular damage, has a 1x crit modifier, so perfectly average. Costs 38 action points to use in VATS, which is fairly high for a melee weapon, but it's not too bad. You can still use it quite a few times in VATS, and this weapon, just like all melee weapons, does have a unique melee attack. All of the hammers have the same unique melee attack in VATS, which is called Mauler. And Mauler makes it so that you can knock down enemies as well as you deal extra damage, which is really, really good. It's one of the best VATS attacks in the entire game. You just have to have 50 melee in order to unlock this once you're in VATS. And yeah, it's really strong because it works on just about everything in the game. The sledgehammer weighs 12, so it is a very heavy weapon. You can cut this in half with heavyweight, which can be kind of useful. You may not be carrying around a whole lot of super sledges though in the first place, or just regular sledgehammers for that matter. And the sledgehammer has 150 item health, making it so that it's pretty durable, as you would kind of expect. You would think a sledgehammer would be pretty durable. For the basic pros of these weapons, they do really high damage, the super sledge more so than the regular sledgehammer, and they have very strong VATS attacks. That's actually really good. The Mauler attack is one of the best ones, and all melee and VATS is just good in general, so that's pretty nice. The cons to these all kind of have the same type of cons. They have a slow attack speed, so you can't attack super quickly, and it makes it so things like Super Slam aren't as consistent as they might be with other weapons, although that's not entirely necessary, because sometimes you might just one-shot stuff with the sledgehammers, so, you know, whatever there. These can be kind of rare. The regular sledgehammer, not so much. You can find those around fairly easy, and you can buy them pretty easy too. The super sledges are more rare until you get to the late game, where then they start spawning in more often on regular enemies, so you can take them off of them, and then they're not so bad to find. And these all are very heavy. The sledgehammer is the lightest at 12 weight, which is still pretty heavy, and the super sledges go all the way up to 20 weight, so they're not the easiest thing to be carrying around. There's quite a few perks that help out with the sledgehammer and just melee in general, so let's talk about them. Slayer is really good because it gives you increased attack speed, and that helps out with these weapons because they are fairly slow, but it helps out with any melee weapon. You've got Heavyweight, which Heavyweight makes it so you can cut these weights in half, so Sledgehammer goes down to 6 and the Super Sledges go down to 10, which is more manageable. You may not necessarily need that though, because you're likely not going to be carrying around a whole bunch of these at a time, since you'll probably be able to fix them up with either weapon repair kits or jury rigging, and jury rigging makes it so melee gets really easy to repair with anything. You can just carry around pool cues then if you want. Super Slam is fantastic. It makes it so that you can knock down enemies, and two-handed weapons have the highest chance to knock down enemies, and if you knock an enemy down and it's a 1v1 situation, you can easily beat them to death before they're going to be able to get up. It's really strong on the Super Sledge in particular. Stonewall can be pretty useful because it makes it so you can't get knocked down, and if you get knocked down, then it's also really easy to beat you up, so that can be really useful for you. Piercing Strike is fantastic because it gives you armor breaking, which is good on any melee or unarmed weapon. And Purifier is fantastic for getting rid of any sort of abomination like Death Claws, which the Super Sledge is also pretty decent at dealing with. Sledgehammer's not as much, but either way. The regular Sledgehammer, I'd probably put it up into C tier on my tier list. It's a perfectly fine weapon, but does get outcompeted fairly quick. And it's just not really one of the best two-handed weapons, but it's not a terrible weapon by any means. You could absolutely just take the regular Sledgehammer and go through the entire game if you wanted to. It just wouldn't be the strongest melee option. The Super Sledge requires 100 melee weapons and 8 strength to wield effectively. As you'd kind of expect, it's a big, heavy sledgehammer, so it's going to require quite a bit of strength to wield, as well as melee weapons. The Super Sledge does 70 damage per hit, which is very high. That is very nice for a melee weapon. This does 111 damage per second, which is pretty good. That can be increased if you have things like Slayer, but this doesn't attack super fast, but it attacks reasonably quick, at least once you have attack speed perks. This one does 35 crit damage on hit, which is kind of weird. For some reason, the Super Sledge's crit damage is actually cut in half from their regular damage, so hitting crits with them is still a bonus to the weapon, and melee crits are always good. But it's not as strong as some other melee weapons are for some odd reason. This is a 1x crit modifier, so perfectly average, costs 38 action points just like the Sledgehammer. Weighs 20 weight, so it's even heavier, but you can cut that in half with heavyweight, so that can be kind of nice. And has surprisingly less item health than a regular Sledgehammer at 100. I don't know why that is, but Super Sledges can break a little bit faster than the Sledgehammer. They don't break super fast, but it is kind of noticeable. So the Super Sledge is all around better than the regular Sledgehammer. And I would probably put the regular Super Sledge into either the high A tier or the low S tier. It's a really good melee weapon that works really well against everything. I had no problem taking out Death Claws with this on my melee build. It's usually considered like an endgame melee weapon, and it is quite strong. Although there is a lot of really good melee weapons in New Vegas as well, so Super Sledge is fantastic. Then there is also a unique version of the Super Sledge, which is called Oh Baby. You can get this one in a cave above Jacobstown. You do have to run all the way up there, but you can just run there anytime that you would like. There is invisible Night Stalkers in it, which makes it rather dangerous, but if you know what you're doing and you know where to go, you can just run in and loot the mutant that has this, or I guess it's next to his body. Pick this up, and then you've got an even more powerful Super Sledge. This one does look a little bit different. It's kind of rusted. This one also requires 100 melee weapons and 8 strength to wield. This one does even more damage at 80 damage per hit, so it hits very, very hard. It's one of the hardest hitting melee weapons in the game. This does 139 damage per second, so still swings kind of slow, but it's fast enough most of the time. Does 40 crit damage. Again, I don't know why the crit damage is so much less on this weapon, but I mean, it's still going to be added to your regular attack, so it's still nice. But it is something to consider. This one has a 1x crit modifier, so average. Costs slightly less action points at 35. I don't know if that really makes that much of a difference for a VATS build, but it is somewhat of a difference, so that's kind of nice. This one also weighs 20, and this one also has 100 item health. Oh Baby, I would probably move all the way up into S tier. You could argue some other melee weapons could be better than this. I would say that Oh Baby is probably in the top 10 of melee weapons, though. It's quite good, it's quite strong, hits really hard, and feels really nice to be using. Regular Super Sledge is very similar to that, where it's also a very, very good weapon. Today we're going to be taking a look at the last 3 melee weapons that we need to talk about for, well, all of the melee weapons. These are 3 blunt weapons that don't really have much in common, but it'd be kind of weird to have their own individual videos because there's not going to be too much to talk about between them. So these are all blunt weapons, and in this video we have the War Club, the Shovel, and the X2 Antenna. Or antennae, depending on how you want to say it. So let's begin with the War Club. This is a DLC weapon that you can find in Honest Hearts. This is what the dead horses wield. You can buy this from Joshua as soon as you get into Honest Hearts. And this weapon's pretty cool. So this weapon is a wooden war club with a horse head on it. This one requires 25 melee and 2 strength in order to wield. So very low melee, very low strength. If you want to run right to Zions with a melee character, this one is a really good option. This one does 19 damage per hit, which is okay. 57 damage per second. The war club does attack fairly fast. This one has 19 crit damage, same as its regular damage, has a 1x crit modifier, costs 21 action points to use in VATS, weighs 3 weight, and has 200 item HP. It has a lot of item HP. It doesn't break very fast, which is good, and it doesn't weigh too much. Action points are fine. This does have the unique VATS attack of Lights Out, which is the same as like the lead pipes. This is a little bit more damage for a little bit more action points, which is okay. It's nothing crazy, but it's not bad overall. Let's go down to the pros and cons, and we'll talk about each of these because they're different weapons. So the pros to the War Club is that it actually has really good damage per second. That is nice, and it's pretty good in VATS. Those are also good. It also has good item HP. The only con I can really think of to the War Club is that it is a DLC weapon, so you do need to go and do Zion. Although, that's not a super long DLC, nor is it a very difficult DLC for most players to do, because they give you a ton of healing in that. There's so much food just laying around in Zion that you basically have unlimited healing, which is good. And since it's a buy weapon that you can just get from Joshua, it doesn't really take that long to actually buy a War Club and to mod it out. And Joshua also always has the mods, as well as I believe Daniel also has the mods and maybe the weapons as well. So you can always get these, and they're not going to be super expensive to buy. So War Clubs are pretty cool. You could even get a War Club off of a dead horse. Just pick that up and then modify it later, which is kind of nice. And there's also quite a few perks that help out with these weapons. So we have Heavyweight. So this will only affect the X2 antenna. This does cut its weight in half though, so it goes from 15 weight down to 7.5 weight, which is pretty good. This won't affect the War Club or the Shovel, they don't weigh enough for that, but all the other ones will. So we have Slayer. Slayer is always fantastic for a melee or an unarmed build. Faster attack speed is always good. Then you have Super Slam, knock down enemies with any weapon like this. With the other two weapons, they're two-handed, so they're more likely to do it, but the War Club is fantastic at this because it attacks so dang fast that you can knock down enemies and usually bully them with it. Purifier is really good because it lets you do more damage towards ghouls, super mutants, death claws, any sort of abomination, so that's really good. And then you also have Piercing Strike to punch through armor, fantastic on any melee or unarmed weapon that doesn't already have that. All of those are really good. For an overall rating for the War Club by itself, I think I'd put this one into B tier. It's a solid all-around melee weapon. Nothing way crazy, but still quite good. I really like it. It's probably one of my favorite melee weapons. There are some better ones, though, and let's talk about the modded version of the War Club, too, since this can have 2 mods on it, and it does make it quite a bit better. It can have the Casings and the Honors. Casings give it 5 more base damage, so it goes from 19 to 24 base damage, which is pretty good. That's actually quite good for a one-handed melee weapon. The major one, though, is the Honors. The Honors actually increase its attack speed by 25%, so that's a huge buff for the War Club. It makes it really good. Its damage per second jumps up quite a bit, and I would actually put this one a tier higher. I would move the modded War Club from B tier all the way up to A tier. I think it's really strong. I still don't think it's one of the best one-handed melee weapons. I still think Chance's Knife and Bloodnap are a bit better. I should also mention, I forgot one of the perks that actually helps out with the War Club too. Cowboy actually helps this out, because for whatever reason, I guess this counts as like a hatchet or a cowboy style weapon. It makes sense. So yeah, the War Club can get a bit better from that, and that does make it actually pretty decent. It's just like I said, I think there are some other one-handed melee weapons that are a little bit better, like Chance's Knife, like Bloodnap, but the War Club is quite high up there with most of those weapons. It's really cool, and if you like using it over those ones, I totally understand. The War Club's also a sneak-in weapon, which is pretty cool if you have 50 sneak. If you want to take these into a casino, then it's pretty strong in there. Alright, let's move from the War Club over to the Shovel now. The Shovel is one of the earliest melee weapons you can get. You can actually get one of these right outside of Goodsprings if you go down to the water source. There's always one placed against one of the water holes over there. You can just pick it up. It's a fully fixed up shovel, and the shovel is actually a pretty decent early game melee weapon if you want to be using it. This one requires 0 melee weapons and 3 strength to wield, so pretty much any melee character is going to be able to use this. Really, any character is probably going to be able to use this. This one does 12 damage per hit, so it has somewhat low damage per hit, 21 damage per second. It doesn't swing super fast, but it is a two-handed melee weapon, so you do get that extra reach, which is kind of nice. This one does 20 crit damage. It actually has pretty decent crit damage for some reason, and it has a 3 times crit modifier. Again, I don't know why, but if you're going with a crit build for melee, this one's actually pretty decent. This one costs 28 action points to be using in VATS, which is okay for a two-handed melee weapon. That's around normal. It does have a good VATS attack with Grand Slam. That's the same thing that the baseball bat has, and what the pool cue has, which gives you a lot more damage, but it does cost more VATS for you to use that. This one weighs 3 weight, so it's not super heavy. Same weight as the War Club we just talked about, kind of weirdly enough. And this one has 300 item HP, which is really good. That makes it so the shovel does not break, and you can use this for quite a while until you get a better melee weapon, which the shovel actually has its own unique effect too, where you need a shovel in order to dig up graves. If you dig up a grave, then there might be something good in it. Graves are kind of randomized as to what they can have in them. Generally, it's low-level gear and various items and ammo that they can have in them. There are some set graves that have better gear in them, though. If you run over to the Yangtze Memorial right outside Goodsprings, that one can have better stuff. If you run up to Chance's grave, you get Chance's Knife. That's a guaranteed one. And then you can also go over to Wolf's Horn Ranch and dig up the grave there, and you are guaranteed to get better gear from there. When I did my grave robber only run for just using the shovel and using whatever weapons I found inside of there, I found like a laser RCW at the one at Wolf's Horn. I found an incinerator over at the little Yangtze Memorial, and of course I found Chance's knife up at Chance's grave. As well as when you first start out with the game, you can dig up the graves in Good Springs and potentially get some decent early game weapons, because it can spawn pretty much all of the low tier weapons. You can get silent 22s, 9mm, 357s, single shot shotguns, varmint rifles. I think that's about all of it. There might be some melee weapons that you can get too, but I don't fully remember those. For the pros of the shovel, this one also is really good at the start. It's actually a really good early game weapon. It's got good item HP, swings okay, has good crits. That's all really nice. Cons is that it will fall off later compared to other two-handed weapons, but if you just want to carry it around just to dig up graves, it's not necessarily that big of a con, because you don't need one that's super fixed up, and it's not going to weigh you down very much. For an overall rating for the shovel, I think I'm going to put this up into C tier. I think it's a fairly solid melee weapon, honestly. It's really good at the start, but then it will fall off later. It's basically like this one, and I'd say the broad machete are the two best melee weapons that you can consistently get at the start, unless you want to run up and get Chance's knife. But then that beats out like 90% or 95% of the other melee weapons that you can get just in the regular game. But you do need a shovel to get it, so shovel is also pretty good for that too. Now let's move over to the X2 antenna. This is the unique antenna that you get during Old World Blues. You do need to grab this because it's related to a quest, and it's related to the mainline quest in order for you to get out of Old World Blues. And this one is kind of interesting because this one is an electricity weapon, which we've talked about those before. So this one requires 75 melee and 7 strength to wield. A lot of melee, a lot of strength. It is a big two-handed weapon, so that kind of makes sense. This one does 65 damage per hit, which is quite high. This one does 70 damage per second. It doesn't swing super fast though, so that is something to keep in mind. And it does take up a decent amount of your screen when you are swinging it. This one only has 23 crit damage, weirdly enough. It does less damage than it has regular damage. I don't know why. There's quite a few melee weapons like this, but this one seems particularly low. Has a 1x crit modifier, which is perfectly fine. Only costs 22 action points, which is fairly low for a weapon like this. I'm surprised it actually costs that low. This one also has its own unique VATS attack called Pain Frequency, which is a lot more damage for slightly more action points. This one's actually really good for a VATS attack. This one weighs 15 weight, which we discussed briefly earlier with heavyweight, so if you do have heavyweight, you can cut that down to 7.5 weight, making it pretty manageable. 15 weight is fairly heavy even for a big two-handed melee weapon. This one has 125 item HP, so the least amount of item HP out of the weapons we've talked about, but that's still a decent amount of item HP, especially for how slow this one swings. You're probably not going to be breaking it super quick, and it does hit pretty hard with each of those swings. This one also, since it is an electricity weapon, does extra damage towards robots. This is 50 bonus damage towards any of the Mojave bots, less damage towards any of the Old World Blues robots, and less damage towards power armored enemies, but you do get bonus damage towards all of those. This one can prove to be a pretty decent melee weapon in Old World Blues, because you can either take this or you can take the Proton Axes. You get extra damage towards the Robo Scorpions and against more of the robots. Even though it is reduced from the Mojave's robots, it still has a decent amount of bonus damage on top of it. For the pros of the X2 antenna, this one does actually have pretty good damage per hit, and it does have the extra electricity damage, which is nice, so you do get extra damage towards robots. Cons, this one is heavy. It's also a DLC weapon, so you're going to have to go to Old World Blues, although Old World Blues is not a super difficult DLC either. It's not like Dead Money or The Divide, where you might have to go all the way through the DLC in the case of Dead Money, or in some of the cases of The Divide, like the best weapons and best gear are like 2/3 the way through or all the way through the Divide, so yeah, this one isn't going to be as bad, I wouldn't say. For an overall rating for the X2 antenna, I'd probably put this one up in A tier. I think it's a pretty solid melee weapon. Does good damage per hit. I still don't usually take it over like the Proton Inversal Axes. I think those ones are better. But the antenna is not bad at all either. And that'll do it for all the melee weapons in New Vegas. We have went over all of them now. So tell me your thoughts on the War Club, the Shovel, or the XO2 antenna, or all three of them if you would like to. Thank you guys so very much for watching this. I hope that you guys enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye, everybody.